25 Pinkerton men with Winchester rifles, a mountain gun bought from a corrupt army quartermaster, a killer in a black bowler hat with a Bible in his pocket hired to burn a cabin to the ground and put a bullet in every man on that mountain. And inside that cabin, a girl in a green silk dress who had walked 850 miles to die a different death than the one waiting for her in Chicago. She did not die that winter, friends. But what happened on Gray's Peak in November of 1878 is a story I have carried for 60 years. Pull your chair a little closer to the fire. Let me tell you what happened next. The wind came down off the high country that November afternoon like something with teeth. It tore at the wooden shingles of the Silver Plume assay office, rattled the dry leaves of the cottonwoods along Clear Creek, and pushed a thin gray dust through the rutted streets of the mining town. Above the peaks, the sky had gone the color of old pewter. Snow was coming. Every man and woman on that boardwalk could feel it in their bones. But this story does not begin in Silver Plume. This story begins in a place far from these mountains, in a city where men with clean hands and black souls signed papers that killed people they would never meet. This story begins in Chicago. They called it a joke. Four wealthy men sitting in a leather-paneled office on the top floor of a building that overlooked Lake Michigan, surrounded by cigar smoke and crystal decanters of Tennessee bourbon. Nathaniel Crane Ashford, the railroad baron with hands that had never done labor, and a soul as dark as the coal his trains carried, raised his glass to the others. He had arranged the wedding for the 15th of November, the day he would swallow the entire Harlow Railroad empire with a single signature. He laughed when he thought of his bride to be the young Evelyn Harlow, 22 years old, counting down the days in the gilded cage of his Lakeshore Drive estate. He thought she was a sparrow in a golden cage. He thought she did not understand what was happening to her. But that girl had a plan of her own. And he did not know Marcus Boone. And he certainly did not know what Evelyn Harlow would do on the night of November 13th. Friends, sometimes the stone a man throws away is the diamond he has been searching for his whole life. Pull your chair a little closer to the fire. Let me tell you what happened next. I am Marcus, your narrator tonight, and this story has stayed with me a long time. My grandfather told it to me when I was a boy, sitting on his porch up in the wet mountains of southern Colorado, wrapped in an old wool blanket while the coyotes called from the foothills. Some stories you forget. Others stay with you forever. This one stayed with me. Quick favor before we go further. If you love these frontier tales, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this story with more folks who need to hear it tonight. Now then, back to our story. Marcus Boone sat on the wooden stoop of his cabin 10,000 feet up the side of Gray's Peak and took a long pull of bitter black coffee from a tin cup. His hand shook just a little as he raised it to his lips. It was not fear. Marcus Boone had not feared anything in 12 years on this mountain, not the bears that came down off the high country in the lean times of spring, not the avalanches that rumbled through the canyons in March, not the long blue cold of January, when a man could lose his fingers if he did not pay attention to the signs. No, the shake in his hand was the memory of last winter. He had taken the fever in early January. He had been alone in the cabin for 3 days before the worst of it came on him, and when the sickness took hold, it took hold completely. For 10 days and 10 nights, he had lay in his bunk under 3 layers of buffalo hide, sweating through the linen sheets, listening to the wind howl outside the chinked logs, listening to his own ragged breath, wondering if this was the day he would die. The fire in the stove had gone out on the 5th day. He had been too weak to feed it. He could see the cold creeping into the cabin like a living thing, white frost forming on the inside of the window panes, his own breath turning to ice in his beard. He had lay there and looked up at the rough-hewn timbers of the cabin ceiling, and he had thought to himself plainly and without fear, I am going to die alone in this place, and no one will know for months. The mules will starve in the barn. The fox will get into the chicken coop. And come spring, when some passing trapper finally finds my body, my own brother will not even know where to bury me. That thought had been worse than the fever. Marcus had survived. He always survived. On the 11th day, the fever had broken, and he had crawled to the wood box on his hands and knees and rebuilt the fire with shaking hands. He had eaten dried elk meat soaked in melted snow. He had nursed himself back to walking by the third week. By the time the spring thaw came in late April, he was lean as a winter wolf. His beard shot through with new gray at the chin and temples, his pale blue eyes a little harder, a little colder than they had been before. But the thought stayed. A man should not die without hearing another human voice. That thought had brought him down off the mountain in October. That thought had walked him into the offices of the Silver Plume Gazette. That thought had carried his pen across the rough, yellow paper of an advertisement bound for the Matrimonial Times in St. Louis. Wanted. A practical woman of strong constitution, accustomed to hardship, willing to share the labor of a high country homestead with a quiet man of 38 years. No drinkers, no fancy women. Honest reply welcome. 3 weeks later, a letter had come back. A widow from Missouri named Hannah Coltrane, 32 years old, a farming accident had taken her husband. She wrote in a plain hand asking practical questions. How deep was the root cellar? How much flour did he keep on hand? Did he own a milk cow? She did not ask about love. She did not ask about romance. She asked about survival. Marcus had liked her at once. He had sent her the stagecoach fare and a brief proposal. He had not made it pretty. A man who has lived alone 12 years does not know how to be pretty. Now sitting on the stoop with his bitter coffee going cold in the November wind, Marcus Boone watched the road that wound up from Silver Plume and waited for a stagecoach that carried a woman he had never seen. A wicker behind him. Marcus turned. His brother Thaddeus had ridden up the path on his blood bay mare, his rust-brown beard stiff with frost, a bear hide draped across his broad shoulders. Thaddeus was 35 years old, 3 years younger than Marcus, and he lived in his own cabin 2 miles down the ridge. He came up to the homestead every Tuesday like clockwork to share supper and check on his older brother and pretend that he was not also a man who could not sleep through the nights. Marcus poured him coffee from the pot on the stove. They sat together on the stoop and watched the gray sky. Brother Thaddeus said at last, "You ordered yourself a wife. I told you that was a fool idea." "I caught myself talking to the mule," said Marcus. "A whole month, another winter, and I will be talking to the trees." "So you ordered yourself a farm widow from Missouri, a woman you have never laid eyes on." "I do not need love," said Marcus. "I need a partner, a survivor. She is 32. She knows how to cure a hide and lay in a winter store. I read her letters 3 times each. She is a practical woman." Thaddeus took a slow sip of coffee. The wind pulled at the brim of his hat. "Reckon so," he said. "But what if she is not what she says she is? What if she is something else?" "Then I will deal with it," said Marcus. "A man keeps his word. I sent for her. I will not turn her out into the snow because she is not what I expected." Thaddeus did not reply. He looked at his older brother for a long moment, at the gray in his beard, at the long, thin scar that ran from his right eyebrow down into the line of his cheek, at the calloused hands wrapped around the tin cup. He was thinking that 18 years ago, when their father had finally drunk himself to death in the boarding house in Leadville, Marcus had been the one who carried the family. Marcus had worked the silver mines for 6 years to save the money for this homestead. Marcus had built the cabin with his own hands, log by log. Marcus had never asked for a woman. Marcus had never asked for anything. And now at 38, his older brother had finally asked. He had asked the world for one thing. One human voice in the long, cold winter. Lord, Thaddeus thought, Lord, please let this woman be what she says she is. The narrator should pause here for a moment, friends, because what I am about to tell you is the part of the story that matters most. Marcus Boone did not know it yet, but 3 months from this November afternoon, he would be grateful for every lonely night of those 12 long years, because every one of them had been preparing him for what was coming up that mountain road. The stagecoach left Denver at 4 in the morning. By noon, it had crossed the Continental Divide. By 2:30 in the afternoon, it was rattling its way up the long, winding switchbacks towards Silver Plume, the four big draft horses straining against the harness, the leather springs creaking with every rut and stone. Inside the coach in the corner, farthest from the door, sat a young woman in a travel-stained gown of emerald green silk. Her name was Evelyn Harlow. She was 22 years old. Her hair was the color of honey caught in a glass jar in summer light, pinned up in a complicated coil at the back of her head, with soft tendrils escaping around the sides of her face from the rough motion of the road. Her eyes were the deep blue of cornflowers. Her skin was the pale porcelain of a young woman who has spent her life behind glass windows and inside heavy drawing rooms. She wore small gold earrings and a single cameo brooch at the throat of her dress, and she clutched a small leather valise to her chest, with both white-knuckled hands as if it contained the only thing she had left in the world. Which in fact it did, inside that valise. A silk nightgown neatly folded, a velvet jewelry box containing a diamond necklace that had belonged to her grandmother, three thick stacks of $20 gold double eagles totaling $5,000, a small pearl-handled Derringer pistol loaded with 2 rounds, a folded newspaper clipping from the Chicago Tribune dated the morning of November 14th. Harris Evelyn Harlow missing. Railroad Baron Nathaniel Crane. Ashford offers $10,000 reward for safe return of his bride. She did not know it yet, but the woman whose identity she was wearing, whose stagecoach ticket she had used, whose name was written in the marriage advertisement she carried, that woman had not died of cholera, as Evelyn would soon claim. That woman, Hannah Coltrane, had been killed by a single bullet from Cyrus Shaw 2 nights ago in the alley behind the Pinewood Hotel in Chicago, where she had gone to deliver Evelyn the false identity papers. Shaw had been waiting. He had taken the papers, made copies, and sent the originals on with Evelyn so that the trail would lead Crane Ashford precisely where Crane Ashford wanted it to lead. Hannah Coltrane was buried in an unmarked grave behind a Catholic church on the south side of Chicago. No one had come to her funeral. Evelyn did not know any of this. She thought Hannah was on a train to her sister in St. Louis with $1,000 and a head start on a new life. The stagecoach jolted hard over a rut. Evelyn pressed her hand against the window glass to steady herself. She looked out at the gray pine forests of the Front Range, at the snow that had begun to fall in scattered flakes, at a frozen waterfall of ice glittering on the side of a granite cliff. She had never seen mountains like this in her life. She had been born in a brownstone on Astor Street. The biggest hill she had ever climbed was the front steps of the Chicago Public Library. She drew a slow breath and rehearsed the story in her head one more time. I am Hannah Coltrane. I am a widow from Boone County, Missouri. My husband Eli died of a kick to the head from a draft horse last spring. I have no children. I have no living parents. My sister Evelyn died of cholera in St. Louis 3 weeks ago. I have come west because I have nowhere else to go. She closed her eyes. The lie tasted of ashes in her mouth. I am Hannah Coltrane. I am a widow from Boone County, Missouri. The narrator must tell you something now, friends, that Evelyn herself did not yet know. The man waiting for her at the end of this road, the man whose advertisement she was answering, the man whose face she had never seen in any photograph, that man was not the kind of man who could be lied to for very long. Marcus Boone had spent 12 years reading the faces of trapped animals, a frightened mule, a wounded coyote in a snare, a bear caught on the wrong side of a winter den. Marcus Boone knew terror when he saw it, and he knew the difference between a woman who was telling the truth and a woman who was running for her life. Evelyn Harlow did not yet know that she had no idea what she was walking into. The stagecoach turned the last bend and began the long downhill grade into the rough mining town of Silver Plume. She drew a deep breath. She held the leather valise to her chest like a shield, and she prepared to step out of one life and into another. The bell on the steeple of the Silver Plume Methodist Church was ringing 3 o'clock when the stagecoach pulled into the muddy main street and the 4 big horses stamped to a halt in front of the assay office. Marcus Boone was already on his feet. He had been waiting on the boardwalk for the better part of an hour. His bear hide coat draped across his broad shoulders, his hat pushed back on his head, his pale blue eyes fixed on the road. Beside him stood Thaddeus, leaning casually against a porch post, but watching with the same sharp attention. The stage agent, a heavy-set man named Josiah Miller, who had lived in Silver Plume for 30 years and served as part-time mayor for the last 12, climbed up onto the wheel and began handing down trunks. The stagecoach door swung open. The first thing that came out was a green silk slipper, mud-stained at the toe that paused on the iron step. The second thing was a gloved-hand white kid leather, soft and clean. It gripped the door frame to steady itself. The third thing was Evelyn Harlow. She stepped down into the muddy street, and the entire town of Silver Plume seemed to draw a single breath together. Marcus felt the blood leave his face. The woman standing in the road was not Hannah Coltrane. She was 22 years old at most, and she was dressed in a gown of emerald silk that had probably cost more money than every cabin on Gray's Peak put together. Her honey-colored hair was caught up in a Chicago drawing room style that no farm widow in Missouri would have ever known how to fashion. Her skin had never seen a day of outdoor labor. Her hands were not the hands of a woman who had ever cured a hide or laid in a winter store. Her eyes, large and blue and frightened, swept over the boardwalk crowd in a single glance, and Marcus saw what was in those eyes immediately. He had seen that look in the eyes of a doe trapped in a deadfall. He had seen it in the eyes of a fox with its leg in a steel jaw trap. He had seen it once years ago in the eyes of a young miner who had come up from the shaft after a cave-in had killed 17 of his fellows. It was the look of an animal that knew it was being hunted. Marcus turned slowly and looked at his brother. Thaddeus had pushed himself off the porch post and was staring at the woman with his mouth slightly open. "Brother," Thaddeus murmured, "that is not your bride." "That is not my bride," Marcus said quietly. "Brother, that woman walked out of a Boston parlor." "I see her, Thaddeus." "Brother, what in the everlasting name of the Lord are you going to do?" Marcus did not answer. He stepped down off the boardwalk into the muddy street, his heavy boots crunching on the frozen ruts, his long shadow falling across the small woman in the green dress. As he came closer, he could see her better. He could see the trembling in her gloved hands. He could see the dust along the hem of the dress, deep and ground in the dust of 3 days of stagecoach travel. He could see a faint pale line on the ring finger of her left hand where a heavy ring had been until very recently. He stopped 3 feet in front of her. "Ma'am," he said. His voice came out lower than he had intended, scraped raw from the cold. He cleared his throat. "Ma'am, is there anyone else still in the coach?" Evelyn Harlow looked up at him. She had not expected him to be so tall. She had not expected him to be so weathered. She had not expected the gray streaks in his beard or the long, pale scar that ran down through his right eyebrow. She had not expected the deep, slow, careful kindness that lay behind the hardness of his face like a candle behind a frosted window. She had been preparing herself in the long miles up from Denver for a brute, a drunken trapper, a man who would put rough hands on her the moment they were alone. She had not been preparing herself for this. "No, sir," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. "I was the only passenger remaining from Denver." Marcus nodded slowly. He did not look away from her. "I am here to meet a Mrs. Hannah Coltrane," he said, "from Boone County, Missouri. I sent her the stagecoach fare myself." Her gloved hands tightened on the leather valise. "I am she, sir," she said. "I am Hannah Coltrane." The lie hung in the cold air between them. Marcus Boone heard it. Marcus Boone watched her. He did not move. He did not change his expression. He simply looked at her the way a man looks at a track in the snow, reading every detail, weighing every piece of evidence against every other piece of evidence, fitting it all together in the slow, patient way of a man who has spent 12 winters learning the difference between truth and the appearance of truth. She was lying. Her hands were too soft, her dress was too fine. Her vowels were too round, the careful, long vowels of a young woman who had been educated by a private tutor in a brownstone parlor and had never been told to speak any other way. The Chicago newspaper inside that valise he could not yet see, but he could see the truth of her in her eyes. She was terrified, and she was running for her life, and she was using a name that did not belong to her. He felt three things in his chest in that moment. He felt anger because he had been deceived. He felt pity because he could see in her face what it had cost her to walk down off that stagecoach and tell that lie. And underneath the anger and the pity, he felt something else, something that surprised him so much he almost stepped back. He felt the same protective fury he had felt that day 18 years ago, watching his father drink himself toward the grave, and knowing that he, Marcus, was the only one who could stop the family from falling apart. This woman, whoever she was about to be his problem. Behind him, Marcus heard the heavy thud of a boot stepping down off the boardwalk. Abel Fairweather, the proprietor of the Silver Plume General Store, had come down to enjoy the spectacle. Fairweather was a thick-necked, prosperous man who fancied himself the leading citizen of the town. He stepped into the street with his hands behind the lapels of his black wool coat and a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Marcus Boone," he called, loud enough for the boardwalk crowd to hear. "It would appear you ordered the wrong package. That is no farm widow. That is a Chicago lady. She will not last a week on Gray's Peak. Send her back, Boone, and save yourself the trouble of digging her grave come Christmas." A few of the men on the boardwalk laughed. A woman in a black bonnet covered her mouth with her hand. Evelyn Harlow felt the laughter touch her like cold water down the back of her neck. For a single moment, she felt all of it. The exhaustion of 3 days of stagecoach travel, the grief of her father's death 4 months ago, falling from a balcony in his railroad office onto the marble floor below his pocket watch, crushed in his hand by the man who had pushed him. The terror of the last 6 weeks locked inside Crane Ashford's Lakeshore Drive estate, listening to the workmen building the wedding gazebo in the garden, where she would soon be married off to her father's murderer. The grim resolve of 2 nights ago, slipping out the servant's entrance in Hannah Coltrane's dress with $5,000 stitched into the hem, climbing into a hired hack and not looking back. The endless miles of the railroad to Denver. The freezing dawn climb up through the Front Range. The lie she had been rehearsing in her mouth for 3 full days. And now this, some pompous shopkeeper laughing at her in the street. Something straightened in her spine. She lifted her chin. She turned her head slowly and looked at Abel Fairweather, and she spoke clearly enough that every man on the boardwalk could hear her. "Sir," she said, "I do not know you, and your judgment of my endurance is not yours to make. I will survive, and I will thrive, and I will do it without your kind permission." The boardwalk went quiet. Fairweather's smile faded a little. Marcus Boone did not move, but something inside his chest moved a small surprise shift, like the first crack in river ice when the spring thaw begins. He had not expected her to speak. He had expected her to cry. He turned slowly toward Fairweather. His pale blue eyes were as cold as the high country in February. "Mr. Fairweather," he said, "the lady is my wife. The next time you wish to speak about my wife, you will speak directly to me. Is that understood?" Fairweather's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "I meant no offense, Marcus," he said. Marcus did not answer. He turned his back on the man and looked at Josiah Miller, still standing on the wheel of the stagecoach with a leather trunk in his hands. "Josiah," he said, "get her trunks. We are leaving." "Now wait," Marcus said, Josiah climbing down with the trunk. "There is the matter of the marriage license. You sent for a Mrs. Coltrane. This here lady has the letters with her, but the name on the license needs to match what she signs." Marcus looked at Evelyn. He held her eyes for a long moment, long enough for her to feel the question in them, long enough for her to feel that he had seen her lie and was choosing to set it aside at least for now. "She will sign Hannah Coltrane today," Marcus said quietly. "We will visit your office in the spring and amend it. Bring the papers. We will sign before we ride out." "I do not know that the law allows for an amendment," said Josiah uncertainly. "Then we will sign a temporary affidavit," said Marcus, "drawn up by your hand and witnessed by you, stating that the bride's true name will be entered upon the marriage license within 6 months by mutual application. My brother Thaddeus has read the territorial code more than once. He tells me it can be done. Behind Marcus, Thaddeus nodded once slowly. The narrator must tell you, friends, that what was happening here was not a simple thing. A man who had lived 12 years alone, a man who had ordered a practical farm widow, was right now standing in a muddy street in the middle of November, signing a marriage affidavit with a frightened young woman in green silk who was almost certainly using a false name. He was binding himself to her in front of God and Josiah Miller and the entire boardwalk crowd of Silver Plume. He was doing it because he had looked into her eyes and seen the trapped animal there, and he had made a decision that no man should have to make about a stranger. He was doing it because his father had drunk himself to death. He was doing it because his brother Thaddeus had buried a wife and a child 7 years ago. He was doing it because he had lay alone in a fever for 10 days last January and stared into the face of a death that nobody would mark. He was doing it because somewhere deep in the iron core of him, Marcus Boone had decided that he was not the kind of man who turned a hunted creature out into the wolves. He did not know it yet, but he was also doing it for another reason. He just had not let himself see it yet. Josiah Miller nodded slowly. "Reckon I can write up an affidavit," he said. "Come up to the office." They climbed the wooden steps to the small assay office that doubled as Josiah's stagecoach office and his mayoral chambers. Inside the dim lamp-lit room with the wind moaning against the eaves, Josiah laid out a piece of cream-colored paper and dipped his iron pen in the inkwell. He wrote in his slow, careful hand a brief affidavit stating that the woman before him would be lawfully wedded to Marcus Boone of Gray's Peak, the bride signing this day under the name by which she had presented herself, the parties agreeing to amend the legal record within 6 months upon her sworn deposition of her true and Christian name. Marcus signed first. His hand was steady. Marcus Boone. Then Evelyn took the pen. Her gloved fingers trembled. She wrote Hannah Coltrane. She handed the pen back. It was done. She was in the eyes of the territory of Colorado and the United States of America, the wife of Marcus Boone of Gray's Peak. She did not feel relief. She felt a strange, hollow opening in her chest, as though she had stepped off a cliff and the ground had not yet come up to meet her. Marcus pulled a heavy buffalo hide coat off the bench by the door. He held it out to her. "Put this on, ma'am. The wagon ride is 5 hours. The temperature drops 20 degrees with every 1,000 feet of climb. You will freeze in that silk before we reach the timberline. I cannot take your coat, sir. You will freeze. I have survived 10 winters worse than the one coming. Put the coat on before I have to dig a grave in frozen ground." His bluntness made her blink, but she allowed him to drape the heavy hide across her shoulders. The coat swallowed her completely. It smelled of wood smoke and pine pitch and old leather and something else, something faintly animal. The smell of a man who had lived alone with his own honest sweat and the smoke of his own fires for 12 years. She pulled it closer around her body and breathed it in without meaning to, and a strange sudden warmth bloomed behind her sternum that had nothing to do with the coat itself. Friends, the narrator must point this out to you because it matters. A young woman who had spent 6 weeks locked in the Lakeshore Drive estate of a man who reeked of French pomade and expensive Cuban tobacco. That young woman had just put on a coat that smelled like the actual honest world, like wood smoke and pine and a hardworking man, and something inside her, something she could not name yet, said quietly, "Yes, this is real." She did not understand the feeling. She was 22 years old, and she had been promised since the age of 17 to a man she despised, and she had never felt that small, quiet yes in her chest before in her life. Marcus did not see her face inside the high collar of the coat. He turned and went out to hitch the team. Outside, the wind had picked up. The snow was beginning to fall in earnest now, fat, soft flakes drifting down out of a slate-gray sky. Thaddeus had already brought the buckboard wagon around from the livery. The 2 big mules, Samson and Delilah, stood stamping in the cold, their breath pluming white. Josiah carried out the trunks and lashed them to the back of the wagon with hemp rope. Marcus lifted Evelyn up onto the wagon seat. She was startlingly light, like a bird with hollow bones. He felt her flinch just a little at his hands at her waist. "I will not lay another hand on you, ma'am," he said quietly. "Beyond what is needed for travel, you have my word on that." She looked down at him from the wagon seat. Her cornflower eyes were wide and dark in the snow light. "Thank you, Mr. Boone." "Marcus," he said. "Marcus," she said. He climbed up beside her and took the reins. Thaddeus mounted his blood bay and pulled his bare hide coat tighter against the wind. "I will ride alongside as far as the timberline," he said. "Then I will turn off for my own place. You will have a hard climb in the snow, brother." Marcus nodded. The wagon pulled out of Silver Plume into the deepening storm. The boardwalk crowd watched them go. Abel Fairweather pulled his coat tighter and walked back to his store, his face still red. Josiah Miller stood for a long time on the porch of the assay office, looking at the affidavit on his desk through the open door. He had been a stagecoach agent for 30 years. He had seen 1,000 brides come west on the Concord coaches. He had seen good marriages and bad marriages, and marriages that ended with a fresh grave behind the church before the first spring thaw. He had never in all his years seen a marriage like this one. He had a feeling, watching the buckboard disappear up into the snow, that he had just witnessed the beginning of something that the high country would talk about for 50 years. He was not wrong. Now then, friends, while Marcus Boone and his new wife began their long climb up into the storm, while Thaddeus Boone rode silent alongside them with his hand close to the rifle scabbard on his saddle, something else was happening 850 miles to the east, in a city built on the shore of a great gray lake. In the offices of the Crane Ashford Railroad and Holding Company, on the top floor of a stone building overlooking the Chicago River, Nathaniel Crane Ashford was reading a telegram. The telegram had come up from the ticket agent at Union Station. It listed every female passenger who had purchased a westbound stagecoach connection on the Denver and Rio Grande line in the last 72 hours. There were 11 names on the list. Crane Ashford was reading them slowly, one at a time, with a silver pen in his manicured hand. He stopped at the 7th name, Hannah Coltrane, Boone County, Missouri, destination Silver Plume, Colorado. Crane Ashford set down the telegram. He closed his eyes. A small, slow, terrible smile spread across his thin, clean-shaven face. He pressed a brass button on the corner of his desk. A door opened across the room and a man stepped through it. He was a thin man in a black broadcloth overcoat with cold gray eyes and a black bowler hat carried in one gloved hand. His name was Cyrus Shaw. The men who feared him called him Deacon because of the way he quoted the Bible while he killed. "She has been found," said Crane Ashford. "She is using the Coltrane woman's identity, as I expected she would. Silver Plume, Colorado. Some God-forsaken mining camp in the high country." Shaw nodded once. "Oh, I'm on. Take 25 Pinkerton men," said Crane Ashford. "Take the special rail car. I want her returned to me alive and unharmed. Do you understand? Live. Unharmed. The wedding will go forward exactly as planned, only 6 weeks behind schedule. The papers will be signed. The Harlow Railroad will become mine. And the man who has her," said Cyrus Shaw quietly, "the one she has gone to." Crane Ashford looked up. His eyes were the color of slate after a long rain. "Kill him," he said. "Kill him, his brother, and any man on that mountain who has seen her face. Burn the cabin to the ground. We will tell the territorial governor she was rescued from kidnappers, and the homestead was destroyed in the firefight. By the time anyone investigates, the bride and the wedding will be a matter of public record, and I will own 17 miles of right-of-way through the very mountain where her rescuer happens to have died." He smiled again. "Two birds with one stone, Mr. Shaw. The girl, and the only stretch of the Denver and Leadville extension that is still in private hands. A Mr. Marcus Boone, I believe. Stubborn old trapper. Refused my agent's offer last spring." Cyrus Shaw inclined his head slightly. "I will leave on the night train," he said. He turned and walked out. Nathaniel Crane Ashford lit a cigar and looked out the window at the Chicago River, where the gray water moved slow and oily under the November sky. He thought of his bride, 22 years old, frightened alone, climbing a mountain in a stagecoach toward a man she had never met. He thought of how she had outsmarted him, slipping past his men in a maid's dress 2 nights ago. He felt briefly a kind of admiration for her. It made what was about to happen even sweeter. Friends, the wagon was halfway up the long climb to Gray's Peak when the snow began to fall in earnest. Marcus Boone urged the mules up the steep switchbacks, his pale eyes scanning the road ahead, while beside him on the wagon seat, Evelyn Harlow shivered violently inside the buffalo hide coat. 5 hours of climbing. The temperature dropped. The light failed. The pines closed in around the road like dark sentinels. They did not yet know that 850 miles to the east, a man in a black bowler hat was already walking down a marble staircase toward a waiting carriage. They did not yet know that 25 Pinkerton men with Winchester rifles and a Hotchkiss mountain gun were being loaded onto a special rail car at the Chicago and Northwestern Depot. They did not yet know that the storm closing in around them was the smallest thing they would survive in the coming weeks. The cabin lights came into view at last, a small, warm yellow square in the vast white darkness of the mountain. Marcus drew the wagon up to the porch. He set the brake. He climbed down stiffly into the snow and walked around to her side. "Welcome home, ma'am," he said, and reached up his big, calloused hands. Evelyn Harlow looked down at him through the falling snow, and for the first time since her father had died, since Crane Ashford had locked her in his estate, since she had slipped out the servants' entrance 2 nights ago into the freezing Chicago dark, for the first time in 4 months, she felt something she had not been expecting. She felt safe. She did not know yet that the safety was an illusion. She did not know yet that the man riding the night train out of Chicago would arrive in the high country before the new year. She did not know yet that everything she had run from was already coming for her with 25 rifles and a mountain gun and a contract to kill the man who was lifting her down off the wagon seat. But the narrator knows, and now, friends, so do you. Pull your chair a little closer to the fire, because the storm is just beginning. The cabin door swung open on its iron hinges, and Marcus Boone stepped aside to let his new bride enter the place that as of 3 hours ago was now her home. Evelyn Harlow stepped over the threshold and stopped. The buffalo hide coat trailed behind her on the rough plank floor like the train of some strange dark wedding gown. Her gloved hands still clutched the leather valise to her chest. The wind howled outside, throwing handfuls of snow against the small frosted windows. But inside the cabin, the air was warm, scented with wood smoke and pine resin, and the faint, sweet smell of dried sage hanging in bunches from the rafters. She looked around slowly. The cabin was not large. 3 steps from the cast-iron stove to the heavy plank table. 3 more steps from the table to the single bed in the corner piled with thick gray wool blankets and the curling fur of a black bear hide. Shelves climbed the rough log walls lined with tin cans, glass jars of preserved peaches, sacks of flour and beans, a careful row of well-thumbed books bound in dark leather. A Henry repeating rifle hung above the door on 2 iron pegs. A double-bitted axe leaned in the corner near the wood box. The stove glowed faintly red along its seams, and a kettle on the back of it had begun to murmur. It was the cabin of a man who had lived alone 12 years and had learned to need very little. Evelyn felt her eyes fill with tears, and she did not entirely understand why. In the gilded music room of the Lakeshore Drive estate, where Nathaniel Crane Ashford had kept her these last 6 weeks, there had been a Steinway grand piano of polished rosewood and a crystal chandelier from a foundry in Bohemia, and silk drapes the color of old blood. There had been French wallpaper and Belgian rugs, and a fireplace large enough for a man to stand inside. There had been everything money could buy, and it had all felt like a coffin. This rough cabin with its 3 steps from stove to bed, this felt like the first room she had ever stood in that did not feel like a coffin. Behind her, Marcus shut the heavy oak door against the wind and dropped the iron crossbar into place. "I will sleep on the floor by the stove," he said quietly before she had to ask. "There is a privacy curtain I can hang across the corner with the bed. You will have your own space. I am not the kind of man who needs to be told twice, ma'am. Marcus, she said. Ma'am, Marcus, please. You said before we were on a first-name footing. He paused. He stood in the middle of the cabin in his snow-dusted canvas duster, a man 6 feet 6 inches tall, in a room with 7-foot ceilings, and for a moment she thought he might smile. He did not. But the line at the corner of his mouth softened. Marcus, then he said. He moved past her toward the stove. He fed 2 sticks of split pine into the firebox, banked the coals, and set the kettle directly over the flame. He did not look at her as he worked. He gave her time. He gave her the small kindness of not staring at her while she found her bearings in his home. Friends, the narrator should pause here for a moment, because what was happening in that cabin in those first quiet minutes was something that does not get put into songs or written into novels. It was the small, careful patience of a man who had spent 12 winters reading the moods of frightened animals. Marcus Boone was not courting his new bride. He was not trying to win her. He was simply giving her room to breathe. He moved slowly, kept his hands visible, kept his voice low, the way you would with a wild creature that had wandered into your shed out of the storm and was not yet sure if you were going to kill it or feed it. She felt that. She did not have a word for it, but she felt it. She set down the leather valise on the plank table. She unbuttoned the heavy buffalo hide coat and let Marcus take it from her shoulders. He hung it on a peg by the door. She stood there in her travel-stained green silk, looking very small in the warm yellow lamplight. You should eat, said Marcus. There is venison stew on the back of the stove from last night. There is bread. There is a tin of peaches if you want something sweet. Sit, I will fix it. She sat at the plank table, and Marcus Boone, who had not cooked for another human being in 12 years, ladled stew into a tin bowl and cut a slab of dark sourdough bread and set them in front of her along with a pewter spoon. She picked up the spoon. Her hand trembled. When was the last time you ate, ma'am? Marcus, when was the last time you ate Evelyn? It was the first time he had said her real name. She had not yet given it to him. He had simply chosen in that quiet, certain way of his to stop calling her by the name she had signed in Josiah Miller's office. He had said it like he was setting down a small stone gently where she could see it. She looked up at him. He did not look angry. Yesterday morning, she said, in Denver, there was bread on the stagecoach, but I could not eat it. You will eat now, he said, slow, or you will be sick. She ate, slow as he had told her. The stew was rich and dark gamey with the wild flavor of high country deer, thick with carrots and parsnips and onions from his root cellar. The bread was dense and a little sour and tore in long ropes when she pulled it. The kettle began to whistle. Marcus made coffee in a battered tin pot, strong and black, and set a cup beside her bowl. He sat down across from her with his own cup, and he watched the snow fall against the window, and he did not ask her a single question. The narrator must tell you, friends, that this was not because he did not have questions. Marcus Boone had a great many questions. He had been thinking about them for the entire 5-hour wagon climb up the mountain. Who was she? Who was she running from? What was in that valise that she gripped so tightly it left red marks on her gloved hands? Why had a Chicago newspaper folded in 3 been peeking out of the side pocket of that valise when he lifted her down from the wagon? He had questions enough to fill the long winter. But he had also seen the trembling in her hands, and he had decided somewhere between the timberline and the cabin that the questions could wait until she had eaten. A man keeps his word, he had told his brother that morning. He had not yet figured out that the word he was keeping was one he had given himself. Outside, the storm tightened around the cabin. The wind pulled long warning notes through the chinking between the logs. The stove popped once sharply as a knot of pitch caught fire. Evelyn finished the stew. She ate half the bread. She drank the coffee, which was bitter and hot and unspeakably good, and she set down the cup and looked at Marcus Boone across the plank table. I should tell you who I am, she said. Not tonight, he said. She blinked. Tonight you are tired, he said. Tonight you are cold. Tonight you have been 3 days on a stagecoach with a story rehearsed in your mouth that you have been dreading to tell. Tonight you have been laughed at in a muddy street by a fool of a shopkeeper. Tonight is not the night for the truth, ma'am. Evelyn, tonight is the night for sleep. Tomorrow then. When you are ready, he said, not before. She felt the tears come. She did not let them fall. She had not let them fall in front of Crane Ashford in 6 weeks, and she would not let them fall now. Why are you being kind to me, she said. Marcus looked down at his coffee for a long moment. Then he looked back up at her. Because 18 years ago, he said slowly, my father drank himself to death in a boarding house in Leadville. He had been a hard man and a cruel man, and he had not been kind to my mother, who died of a winter fever when Thaddeus was 4 years old. When my father went, I was 20 years old, and my brother Thaddeus was 17, and we had nothing but the clothes on our backs and a small grub stake my father had not yet drunk. I have lived alone on this mountain a long time. I have not been a soft man, Evelyn. I do not pretend to be. But I made a promise to myself years ago that I would not turn my face away from a frightened creature when one came to my door. Because once a long time ago, I was the frightened creature, and there was no door open for me. He took a slow sip of his coffee. You are the frightened creature tonight, he said. The door is open. Sleep. She sat very still. She did not know it then, but she would remember those words for the rest of her life. Marcus stood up. He carried the bowls and cups to the wash basin. He banked the stove. He pulled a heavy canvas tarp from a chest at the foot of the bed and rigged it across the corner of the room with a length of cord and 2 iron nails screening off the bed from the rest of the cabin. He laid out his own bedroll on the rough floor near the stove, a doubled buffalo hide and a thick wool blanket, and he set his Henry rifle within arm's reach. I am 6 feet from you all night, he said. The door is barred. The windows are shuttered. You are safe. Sleep, Evelyn. She rose. She took the lamp behind the curtain. She undressed in the lamplight, the green silk gown coming off in soft, heavy folds, and she pulled on the thick flannel nightshirt he had laid out for her on the foot of the bed, a man's nightshirt, far too large that smelled of cedar from the chest where he had stored it. She climbed into the bed, and the bear hide settled over her like the weight of a great warm hand. The wind howled. The fire popped. From beyond the canvas curtain, she could hear the slow, steady breathing of a man who had not slept beside another human being in 12 years. She closed her eyes. For the first time since her father had fallen from a 4-story balcony onto the marble lobby of the Harlow Railroad building 4 months ago. Evelyn Harlow slept without dreaming. The first week was a disaster. The narrator must be honest with you, friends. There is a tendency in stories like this one to skip the hard part, to say that the bride from the city quickly took to the rough life of the mountain and was soon a frontier wife in spirit and skill. That is not what happened in the cabin on Gray's Peak in the 3rd week of November in 1878. What happened was that Evelyn Harlow burned the coffee on the first morning. She did not know how to stoke a stove. She had grown up in a brownstone where servants laid the morning fire before the family was awake. She put too much kindling in the firebox and not enough draft, and the green pine smoked, and the grounds boiled too long and turned to bitter black tar. And when Marcus came in from the barn at sunrise expecting his first cup of coffee, the cabin was full of smoke, and Evelyn was standing in the middle of it, crying silent tears of humiliation. Marcus did not say a word. He opened the windows. He fanned the smoke. He took the burned pot off the stove. He carried it outside, scrubbed it up with the snow, and brought it back in. He showed her slowly and patiently how to lay the kindling in a small teepee with a piece of pine pitch in the middle, how to draw the air in through the lower vent and the smoke up through the flue, how to wait until the flame caught before adding the bigger pieces. He showed her how to count out the coffee with his old tin scoop, how to set the pot on the front of the stove and not the back, how to know it was ready when the brown foam pulled away from the sides. The second pot was drinkable. He drank it without comment, and he kissed the top of her head as he left for the trap line. He did not realize he had done it until he was halfway down the trail to the beaver dam, and by then it was too late to take back. She did not realize he had done it until 2 hours later, when she was scrubbing the burned pot for the third time, and her hand froze on the iron handle, and she stood very still in the cabin and pressed her fingers to the place on her crown where his lips had touched her, and she did not know if she wanted to laugh or to sob. The narrator should tell you, friends, that this is how it begins, not with declarations, not with poetry, not with gilded ballrooms or moonlit gardens. It begins with a burned pot of coffee and a calloused man who does not know what he has done because he has not done it in 12 years and has perhaps never done it at all. It begins small, it begins quiet, it begins like a single warm drop of water on the long blue ice of January. And then it does not stop. Day 3. Marcus tried to teach her to pluck a ptarmigan he had shot at dawn. The bird lay on the plank table, white winter feathers, small dark eyes still bright, and Evelyn stared at it for a full 10 minutes before she could pick it up. She had never killed anything in her life. She had never plucked anything in her life. She got 2 handfuls of feathers off and burst into tears, and Marcus came in from chopping wood and found her with her hands full of white down and her cheeks wet and the bird half done. He sat down across from her at the table. He pulled the bird gently out of her shaking hands. He showed her how to work against the grain of the feather, how to dip the carcass briefly in scalding water, to loosen the harder pin feathers, how to gut the bird with a single careful cut along the breastbone. He did not tell her she was doing it wrong. He simply did it with her slowly, his big hands beside her small ones, and by the end the bird was clean, and the tears had stopped, and Evelyn had laughed once, a small, tired laugh, when a feather floated up in the draft from the stove and stuck to the end of his nose. Day 4, she tried to haul water from the half-frozen creek. She slipped on the ice and went down hard on her right knee, and the wooden bucket clattered down the bank, and the creek water soaked through her dress, and she had to walk back up to the cabin in 20-degree weather with ice forming in the hem of her skirt. Marcus came home that evening to find her sitting by the stove in dry clothes, with her knee swelled up purple and her chin set in a hard, small line of refusal. He did not scold her. He warmed willow bark tea on the stove and made a poultice of yarrow leaves from the cluster hanging in the rafters and bound her knee with strips of clean linen, and he did not say a word about the wasted bucket of water or the ruined dress. He simply said when he was done, "You will not haul water alone again until the spring thaw. We will go together at first light. The creek is treacherous in this season." She nodded. Day 5, he came home from checking the trap line, and he had brought her something. He set it on the plank table without ceremony. It was a long brown canvas dress and a heavy pair of woolen trousers cut to fit a small woman in a thick gray flannel shirt, in a sheepskin vest, and a pair of moccasin boots lined with rabbit fur. "I rode down to Silver Plume yesterday morning while you were still sleeping," he said. "The widow Halloran runs a small shop. She had these on hand. I judged the sizes against your green dress. Take what fits." She looked at the clothes for a long moment. "Marcus," she said, "the green dress. It is a fine dress, ma'am. It is just not a dress for a woman who is going to live on Gray's Peak through a winter." She did not answer for a long moment. Then she stood up and gathered the clothes into her arms and went behind the canvas curtain. When she emerged 10 minutes later, she was wearing the canvas dress and the flannel shirt and the rabbit fur boots, and her honey-colored hair was bound up in a simple braid down her back, and Marcus Boone sat at the plank table and stared at her as if he had just seen the sun come up in a place he had not expected. She blushed. She turned her face away. She walked to the stove and pretended to check the kettle. He did not say anything. He could not say anything. The narrator must tell you, friends, that what Marcus Boone was feeling in that moment was the small, dangerous beginning of something he had decided 12 years ago that he would not allow himself to feel ever again. It is one thing for a man to take pity on a frightened creature in a storm. It is another thing entirely for that man to look up from his coffee one afternoon and see her standing in his cabin in a plain canvas dress with a single braid down her back, and to realize that the cabin had been waiting 12 years for her to stand exactly there. Marcus Boone went out to the barn after supper that night and stayed there a long time. He told himself he was checking on the mules. The mules were fine. He stayed anyway. On the morning of the seventh day, while Marcus was deep in the timber checking his trap line, Evelyn was alone in the cabin kneading the morning bread when she heard the scrape of claws on the porch. She froze. The wooden spoon went still in her hand. A long, low growl rolled in through the chinking of the logs. Something heavy moved on the porch boards. Something hungry. Something that had caught the smell of rising bread on the cold air and had decided that the cabin was prey. She stepped back from the table. Her eyes went to the Henry rifle on its iron pegs above the door. Marcus had taught her to load it on her third evening in the cabin. He had stood behind her in the lamplight, his big hands over her small ones, showing her how to thumb the cartridges into the loading gate, how to lever the action smooth and slow without jamming the brass. He had not yet taught her to fire it. He had said the firing comes when the hands know the loading without thinking. Her hands knew the loading. She crossed the cabin on silent feet. She lifted the Henry off the pegs. She levered around into the chamber. She stepped to the door and she slid the iron crossbar back with her thumb, and she pulled the door open perhaps 3 inches. A gray timber wolf stood on her porch, lean, long winter coat already heavy, yellow eyes, black lips drawn back from white teeth. The wolf was 20 pounds underweight, an old male who had been pushed out of his pack by a younger rival, and he had come down off the high country looking for anything he could eat. He saw the door open. He gathered himself. Evelyn raised the Henry. She did not have time to aim. She did not have time to be afraid. She simply pointed the barrel through the crack of the door at the gray shape on the porch and pulled the trigger. The rifle bucked hard against her shoulder. The wolf yelped, a high broken sound, and twisted in the air and tumbled backward off the porch into the snow. He did not get up. He twitched once and lay still. Evelyn stood in the doorway with the smoking rifle and her ears ringing, and she did not feel triumphant, and she did not feel sick. She simply felt the cold air of the mountain on her face, and she felt very awake, and she understood in that small, clear moment that she had crossed some line she could not uncross. Marcus came running from the timber. He had heard the shot from a quarter-mile away. He came up the porch steps 2 at a time, his own rifle in his hands, and he stopped when he saw her standing in the doorway with the Henry in her hands and the dead wolf in the snow. "Evelyn," he said. He came up the porch. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Did he get inside?" "No." Marcus took the rifle gently out of her hands. He set it back on the pegs. He turned her face up to his with one calloused hand under her chin, and he looked at her for a long moment, and he saw that her cornflower eyes were perfectly clear. Friends, the narrator must tell you something. The young woman who had stepped down off that stagecoach in green silk would have fainted at the sight of a wolf on her porch. The young woman who had spent 6 weeks in a Lakeshore Drive estate would not have known how to load a Henry rifle. The young woman who had wept over a half-plucked ptarmigan 4 days ago would have dropped the rifle at the moment of firing. But that young woman was already changing. She was changing in small, quiet ways that nobody, not even Marcus Boone, had yet fully measured. A wolf had come to her door. She had answered the door with a rifle. "You did right," Marcus said quietly. "You did exactly right. Come inside, Evelyn. The bread is rising." She came inside. He barred the door. He went out 20 minutes later to drag the wolf off the porch, and he skinned it carefully behind the barn, and he tanned the hide that winter and made it into a small shawl for her lined with the rabbit fur he had been saving from his trap line. She wore that shawl for the rest of her life. By the end of the second week, 3 things had happened. First, Evelyn had learned to stoke the stove without smoking out the cabin. Second, she had learned to make coffee that Marcus drank with a small, private smile she did not see. And third, she had begun very slowly to do something she had not done in any of the 6 weeks of her captivity in Chicago. She had begun to hum. A small thing, a barely audible thing, while she kneaded the bread dough on the plank table, while she carried wood from the porch to the stove. A small humming half remembered the melody of a hymn she had learned at her mother's knee in a Protestant church on the south side of Chicago many years ago before her mother had died of pneumonia in the long cold winter of 1860. Marcus heard it on the morning of the 15th day while he was oiling his rifle by the window. He stopped his hands and listened. He did not look at her. He did not want her to know he had heard. He simply listened while she rolled out the bread and hummed the old hymn, and he felt something inside his chest that he had not felt since he was a boy. He felt the cabin become a home. Thaddeus rode up the trail on the afternoon of the 16th day with a brace of snowshoe hares slung over the saddle horn and a small package wrapped in brown paper tucked under his arm. He had not visited since the wedding day. He had given them in the careful, unspoken way of brothers who have lived a long time alone together, the time they needed to find their footing. He stamped the snow off his boots on the porch and came in with the cold air rolling off his coat. Evelyn looked up from the table where she was patching one of Marcus's flannel shirts. The needle in her hand stopped moving. "Sister," said Thaddeus, and inclined his head. "Tad," she said. He smiled at the small contraction of his name. No one had called him Tad since Eliza. "Brought you a wedding gift," he said. He set the brown paper package on the table. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a small wooden box hinged with brass sanded smooth and oiled with linseed until the grain of the cherry wood glowed soft and red in the lamplight. Inside the box, on a bed of blue velvet that he had clearly cut from an old waistcoat, lay a small folding knife with a handle of polished walnut. "Made it last winter," he said. "I did not have anyone to give it to. I was going to sell it in Silver Plume come spring. But it seems to me that a woman on this mountain ought to have a knife of her own, and I figured this one had been waiting for you." She lifted the knife out of the box. It was light and the blade folded out with a clean, small click, and the steel was so well honed that she could see the lamp flame reflected in the edge. "Tad," she whispered. He shrugged. Then he looked at her, and his amber whiskey eyes went serious for a moment. "My brother is not a man of many words, Evelyn. He will not say to you what he ought to say. So I will say it for him. You have made the cabin warmer. Marcus is sleeping through the night for the first time in 12 years. He does not know I know this. But I rode up here 3 nights ago to leave a deer haunch on the porch, and I heard him snoring through the door. He has not snored, sister, since our father died. A man who is lying awake all night does not snore. A man who has finally laid down his burden does. You have given him something, sister. Whatever you brought up this mountain with you, whatever you are still afraid to tell us, you have given him something he had given up on. I just wanted you to know that I know it." Evelyn could not speak. She held the knife in both hands, and she could not speak. Marcus stamped in from the barn at that moment with an armful of split pine, and Thaddeus turned away from the table to spare her, and the moment passed without Marcus seeing it. But Evelyn carried that moment in her chest for the rest of that day and through the night and into the next morning. She carried it like a small, warm stone set under her sternum. She had run from Chicago because she was going to be killed. She had come to this cabin because there was nowhere else to go. She had not come to give anyone anything. She had come to take a name, to take a roof, to take a few months of safety until she could find a way to disappear forever. She had not expected to give. She had not expected to have anything left to give. And yet somehow in the burning of coffee, in the plucking of a small white bird, in the wolf on the porch, in the wearing of a plain canvas dress, in the humming of an old hymn over a loaf of bread, somehow she had given a lonely man back his sleep. That night, after Thaddeus had ridden home down the dark, snowy trail, after Marcus had banked the fire and laid out his bedroll on the floor after the lamp had been turned down low, Evelyn lay in the bed behind the canvas curtain and stared at the rough-hewn ceiling beams and did something she had not done in 4 months. She prayed. Lord, she said, silently into the dark, I do not know what you are doing. I came up this mountain to hide. I did not come to live. I do not know what you are building here. But if you are building something, please let it last. Please let it hold. Please do not let what is coming behind me destroy what you are building. Outside the cabin, the wind had died. The snow fell straight down in the long blue winter darkness. 850 miles to the east in the marble lobby of the Palmer House Hotel in Chicago, Cyrus Shaw was checking out. He paid his bill in crisp new banknotes. He carried a single black leather valise. He wore a black broadcloth coat and a black bowler hat and a pair of black calfskin gloves. And the desk clerk at the Palmer House would later tell the Pinkerton inspector that the man had been the most polite guest he had ever served, and that something about him had made the hair on the back of the clerk's neck stand straight up. Cyrus Shaw walked out into the November afternoon and climbed into a hansom cab. He told the driver to take him to the Chicago and Northwestern Depot. At the depot, a private rail car was waiting on a sidetrack painted black with no markings. 25 Pinkerton men in heavy wool overcoats were already aboard their Winchester rifles cased in canvas, their service revolvers loaded under their coats. In the baggage car, two heavy crates marked Hercules Powder Company sat alongside a long wooden case marked in red stenciled letters, Ordnance U.S. Army, Hotchkiss Mountain Gun 1 each, with ammunition. Nathaniel Crane Ashford had purchased that gun secondhand from a corrupt quartermaster at Fort Sheridan 2 months ago. He had been keeping it in a warehouse on the south side. He had been waiting for an excuse to use it. The excuse had arrived on November 14th in the form of a name on a stagecoach manifest. Cyrus Shaw boarded the railcar. He sat down by the window. He took out a small, leather-bound Bible, well-worn, the gilt of the lettering long since rubbed away. He opened it to a passage in the book of Joshua. He read to himself, his lips moving silently. The conductor blew the whistle. The black private rail car pulled out of Chicago at 4:11 in the afternoon, bound westward through the long, cold night toward Omaha and Cheyenne, and the high country of Colorado. In a small log cabin on the side of Gray's Peak, where a young woman lay curled in a bear hide bed, humming an old hymn in her sleep, while a calloused mountain man slept on the floor beside the stove for the first peaceful night of his 38 years. The narrator must tell you, friends, that what we have been watching these last 16 days, the burned coffee and the plucked ptarmigan, and the canvas dress, and the small wooden knife in its cherry wood box, and the wolf on the porch, all of this has been the work of the calm before the storm. The Lord in his mercy gives his people a small season of peace before the great trials come, so that they will have something to remember, something to hold to when the trials arrive. He gives them a few days of warm fires and quiet meals and small kindnesses. He gives them sometimes a single hummed hymn over a loaf of rising bread. He gave Marcus Boone and Evelyn Harlow 16 days. That was all. On the 17th day in the gray hour just before dawn, while Marcus was outside chopping the morning wood and Evelyn was sleeping behind the canvas curtain, 3 shadows passed along the ridge above the cabin. 3 men on tall horses. The lead rider, wrapped in a black wool coat against the cold, paused on the high trail and looked down through a brass spyglass at the small log cabin in the valley. He counted the windows. He counted the smoke rising from the stovepipe. He noted the position of the barn and the spring house and the woodshed in the angle of the front door. Then he turned his horse and signaled the 2 scouts behind him, and they rode quietly back the way they had come, west along the ridge, toward the small mining camp of Georgetown, 10 miles down the valley, where 22 other men were waiting for them in a rented warehouse with their rifles and their crates and their patience. Cyrus Shaw smiled to himself as he rode. The cabin, he thought, would burn very nicely indeed. Friends, the storm has begun to gather. Marcus Boone had felt something on the wind that morning, and he had not known what it was, and he had cut more wood than he needed and stacked it on the porch in long, careful rows, because some old part of him had said quietly, lay in extra. A hard time is coming. Evelyn Harlow had woken with her heart pounding and had not known why, and she had pressed her hand to her chest and listened to the soft sound of Marcus's axe in the yard, and told herself she was being foolish. Thaddeus Boone, 2 miles down the ridge in his own cabin, had cleaned his Winchester 3 times in 2 days for no reason he could name, and he had ridden up to check on his brother twice in the same week, and he had told himself it was just the long winter making him restless. None of them knew that morning that a man with a Bible in his pocket and 24 killers at his back had just looked down at their cabin through a brass spyglass and decided the angle of the front door. But the storm was coming, and before the next snowfall, the small log cabin on the side of Gray's Peak would be the center of a fight that would be talked about in the saloons and assay offices of Colorado for the next 50 years. Pull your chair a little closer to the fire, friends, because the next 10 days are going to test everything. The 17th day on Gray's Peak began with the smell of wood smoke and frying salt pork, and it ended with a confession that would change the course of 3 lives forever. Evelyn Harlow woke before dawn. She lay in the bear-hide bed for a long, quiet moment, listening to the slow, rhythmic chunk of an axe in the yard, the small, comfortable sound of a man at work in the cold blue hour before sunrise. She had grown accustomed to that sound in the last 16 days. She had grown to wait for it. She knew now that Marcus rose at 4:30 every morning, that he stoked the stove and put on the coffee before he went out, that he split a half cord of wood before breakfast, even on the days he did not need it, because as he had once told her without quite meaning to, a man with an axe in his hand on a cold morning is a man who knows what to do with himself. She rose. She dressed in the canvas trousers and the gray flannel shirt and the sheepskin vest he had bought for her in silver plume. She braided her honey-colored hair into a single loose plait down her back. She pulled on the rabbit fur-lined moccasin boots, and she stepped out from behind the canvas curtain into the warm orange lamplight of the cabin. The coffee was already on the stove. She poured 2 tin cups, set them on the plank table, and went to the small cast-iron skillet hanging on its peg. She laid in 3 thick slices of cured pork from the spring house, set a pot of cornmeal mush to thicken on the back of the stove, and pulled a fresh round of yesterday's bread from the linen cloth where it had been resting overnight. This morning, she thought, this morning I will tell him. She had been telling herself she would tell him for 16 days. She had postponed it on the 2nd day, and the 4th day, and the 7th day, and every day in between. She had told herself she needed time. She had told herself the right moment had not arrived. She had told herself she would tell him after she had earned a little more of his trust, after she had learned the stove and the wood box and the patient art of plucking a winter ptarmigan, after she had become in some small, fragile way the kind of woman who deserved to be told the truth to. But last night, as she had lain awake in the dark behind the canvas curtain, she had heard him snoring. She had heard the slow, steady, untroubled breathing of a man who, after 12 long years of lying awake in the cold, had finally laid down his burden. And she had understood, lying there with her eyes wet, that she could not keep lying to a man who had stopped lying awake because of her. She had to tell him. Today. The door opened and Marcus came in with an armful of split pine, his beard rimed white with frost, his pale blue eyes catching the lamplight. He set the wood down beside the stove and stamped the snow off his boots and shrugged out of his canvas duster, and he saw the breakfast on the plank table and the 2nd cup of coffee and the small braid down her back. He paused in the middle of the cabin the way he had paused every morning for 16 days. He had not yet figured out how to look at her without that small involuntary hesitation, and he hoped she had not noticed. She had noticed. She had been waiting for it. "Sit down, Marcus," she said quietly. "The coffee will go cold." He sat down. They ate. The cabin was quiet save for the small, homely sounds of a man and a woman taking breakfast together. The scrape of a spoon in a tin bowl, the soft crackle of the stove, the low whisper of the wind in the eaves. The first gray light was just beginning to show in the small, frosted window above the wash basin. When Marcus had finished his 2nd cup of coffee, Evelyn set down her own cup and folded her hands in her lap and looked across the table at him. "Marcus," she said, "I need to tell you who I am." He set down his cup. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and laid his big calloused hand over hers very gently. And he said, "All right, Evelyn, tell me." She drew a slow breath. She told him. She began with her father. His name was Edmund Harlow. He had built the Harlow Railroad from nothing, beginning with a single ore line out of the lead mines of Galena, Illinois in 1854. And over 24 years, he had grown it into the second largest privately held railroad in the United States, with 1,700 miles of track running from the Mississippi River to the western edge of Nebraska Territory. He had been a hard man in business and a tender man at home. He had loved her mother, Cordelia, who had died of pneumonia in 1860 when Evelyn was 4 years old. After her mother's death, he had not remarried. He had raised Evelyn himself with the help of a Scottish governess named Mrs. McElroy in the brownstone on Astor Street. He had taught her to read at the age of 5, to play the piano at the age of 7, to balance the household accounts at the age of 12, to read a railroad ledger at the age of 15. He had been her whole world. On the morning of July 17, 1878, 4 months before this November breakfast, Edmund Harlow had been pushed from the fourth-floor balcony of his private office in the Harlow Railroad Building on LaSalle Street in Chicago. The Chicago Tribune had reported it as a tragic accident. It had not been an accident. Evelyn had known it had not been an accident the moment she had been called to the morgue to identify the body. Her father had been a careful man. He had not stood near balcony railings. He had a slight terror of heights left over from a boyhood incident in a hayloft. He would no more have leaned over a 4-story railing than he would have stepped in front of a train. And in his right hand, when they laid him out on the cold marble slab, his fingers had been clenched around the shattered remains of his gold pocket watch. The watch had been broken before he fell. Someone had struck him with it, struck the watch out of his hand and shattered the crystal, and her father had still been gripping the broken case when he went over the railing. The coroner had not noticed this. The coroner had been paid not to notice this, but Evelyn had noticed it, and she had kept the broken watch, and she had said nothing to anyone for 3 full days while she watched and listened and waited to see who would come. 2 weeks later, Nathaniel Crane Ashford came. Crane Ashford was the proprietor of the Crane Ashford Railroad and Holding Company. He owned the largest privately held railroad in the United States, the only one larger than Harlow's. He had been her father's chief business rival for 12 years. He was 47 years old. He was a tall, elegant, clean-shaven man with slate gray eyes and slick black hair and manicured hands that had never done labor. He came to the brownstone on Astor Street on a Tuesday afternoon in August, dressed in a black morning suit, carrying a bouquet of white lilies and a leather portfolio of legal documents. He told Evelyn that her father had named him as her guardian in a codicil to his will. The codicil was a forgery. Evelyn had known her father's handwriting since she was 5 years old. The codicil was a forgery, but the seal of the firm of Whitcomb, Pratt and Ellis was real, and the witness signatures were real, and the probate judge had already signed off on it before Crane Ashford ever walked into her parlor. Evelyn was 22 years old. She was on paper of legal age, but she did not yet hold full title to the Harlow Railroad. Her father's will had stipulated that the controlling 51% share would pass to her on the date of her marriage or on her 30th birthday, whichever came first. He had thought he was protecting her. He had thought that by then she would have chosen a husband worthy of her. He had not foreseen Nathaniel Crane Ashford. By the end of August, Evelyn was living by court order in Crane Ashford's Lake Shore Drive estate. By the middle of September, the engagement had been announced in the Chicago Tribune. The wedding was set for November 15th. She told Marcus all of this in a low, steady voice, her eyes fixed on the worn grain of the plank table, her hand still beneath his. She told him about the 6 weeks of her captivity, the locked doors, the maid who reported her every word back to Crane Ashford, the dressmaker brought in from Paris to fit the wedding gown, the 72 place settings of French silver delivered for the wedding breakfast, the way Crane Ashford had begun in those last weeks to drop quiet remarks at the dinner table Remarks about how easily a young heiress could fall down a flight of marble stairs. Remarks about how her father had been such an unfortunately careless man. When it came to high places, remarks meant only for her dropped between courses of pheasant and consommé, while the silent footman served the wine and pretended not to hear. She had understood by the second week of October exactly what was going to happen to her after the wedding. The 51% would transfer to her husband upon the marriage. By the end of the wedding breakfast, Crane Ashford would have full control of the Harlow Railroad. Within 6 months, perhaps a year, if he was patient, there would be a fall down a marble staircase, or an overturned carriage, or a sudden mysterious fever, and the grieving widower would inherit the rest. The combined Harlow and Crane Ashford lines would form the largest privately held railroad in North America. She had been condemned to die on her wedding day, and she had been given 6 weeks to wear the white silk gown and smile for the wedding portrait. Then in the third week of October, the Lord had sent her Hannah Coltrane. Hannah was a widow from Boone County, Missouri. Her husband, Eli, had been killed by a draft horse the previous spring. She had come to Chicago to find work, and through a placement agency, she had been hired into the Crane Ashford household as Evelyn's personal maid. Hannah was 32 years old. She was strong-boned, plain-spoken, with rough, red hands and clear brown eyes. She had taken one look at Evelyn on her first morning in the house, sitting at the breakfast table across from a man who watched her like a cat watches a sparrow, and she had understood the shape of the thing. 2 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon when Crane Ashford had gone to the Lakeshore Athletic Club, Hannah had come into Evelyn's dressing room and quietly closed the door. "Miss Harlow," she had said, "I have answered an advertisement in the St. Louis Matrimonial Time. A man in the high country of Colorado is looking for a wife. He sent me the stagecoach fare. I was going to tell you next week. I was going to ask Mr. Crane Ashford for my back wages and go, but I have been watching that man at the dinner table. I have been watching how he looks at you, and I have been watching you, miss. I cannot leave a young woman in a house like this. Not when I have a stagecoach ticket in my pocket that no one is expecting any particular face to use. No one in Silver Plume, Colorado has ever seen Hannah Coltrane. They are expecting a farm widow from Missouri. They will get one. Take the ticket, miss. Take my name. Take the letter from Mr. Boone. Take whatever you can carry from the safe. Get out of this house before that wedding. I will go to my sister in St. Louis. I will write to Mr. Boone in 3 months and tell him the truth when you are safely settled. He sounds like a good man, miss. He writes plain. He did not ask me about my looks or my dowry. He asked me how deep my root cellar was at home and whether I knew how to cure a hide and whether I drank spirits. He is a good man, miss. He will help you." Evelyn had wept in Hannah Coltrane's arms for half an hour. On the night of November 13th, 2 nights before the wedding, while Crane Ashford was at a banker's dinner downtown, Evelyn had taken $5,000 in gold double eagles from the safe in his study. She had taken her grandmother's diamond necklace from her mother's old jewelry box. She had taken Hannah Coltrane's stagecoach ticket and the letter from Marcus Boone of Grace Peak, Colorado. She had dressed in Hannah's spare brown dress and a heavy wool shawl, and she had walked out the servants' entrance with a market basket on her arm, as if she were going to fetch the morning bread. A hired hack had taken her to the Union Station. The train had taken her to Omaha, and then to Cheyenne, and then south to Denver. The stagecoach had brought her up the Front Range to Silver Plume, and here she sat on the 17th morning of the rest of her life at a plank table in a log cabin 10,000 feet up the side of Gray's Peak, telling all of it to a man she had married under a false name 16 days ago. When she finished, the cabin was silent except for the low pop of the stove. She did not lift her eyes from the table. Marcus did not move for a long moment. Then slowly he stood up from the bench. He walked around the table to her side. He knelt down beside her chair on one knee, the way a man kneels in a Methodist church, and he took both her small white hands in both of his big callous brown ones, and he said quietly, "Evelyn, look at me." She looked at him. His pale blue eyes were perfectly steady. "You signed Hannah Coltrane on that affidavit 16 days ago," he said. Did you know what I asked Josiah Miller to write into it before you signed? She shook her head slowly. I asked him to write that the bride was signing this day under the name by which she had presented herself, and that the parties agreed to amend the legal record within 6 months upon her sworn deposition of her true and Christian name. I knew you were lying to me, Evelyn. I knew it the moment you stepped down off that stagecoach. I have been looking at the tracks of frightened animals for 12 years. I have never been wrong about one yet. She felt her throat close. I did not marry Hannah Coltrane, he said. I married you. Whoever you were, whatever name you were carrying, the name on the affidavit will be amended to Evelyn Harlow Boone in the spring when we ride down to Silver Plume and swear out the deposition before Josiah. Until then, you are my wife in the eyes of God and the territory of Colorado and any man on this mountain who would lay a hand on you. Do you understand me, Evelyn? She could not speak. He raised her hands gently and pressed his lips to her knuckles. I have one question for you, he said, and only one. Yes, do you want to be Evelyn Harlow Boone? Or do you want me to put you on a stagecoach to San Francisco with $5,000 and a new name and a head start nobody will be able to follow? She stared at him. The narrator must tell you, friends, that this was the moment. This was the moment that the long, lonely winter of Marcus Boone's 12 years on Gray's Peak finally ended, not with his speaking, but with his asking, not with his taking, but with his offering. He had laid the choice in her hand. He had, at the cost of every selfish hope he had been quietly nursing for 16 days, set her free. He had given her in that single sentence the one thing that no one else in her life had given her since her father had died. He had given her a choice. She slid down off the bench onto her knees in front of him. She put both her small, soft hands on the sides of his bearded face, and she looked into his pale blue eyes from less than a foot away, and she said, Marcus Boone, I want to be your wife. I do not want San Francisco. I do not want a new name. I have spent my whole life inside walls that other people built around me. This cabin is the first place I have ever stood that did not feel like a wall. I want to be your wife. He kissed her. He kissed her once, slow and careful, like a man putting down a burden he has carried a long way. And then the cabin was quiet and the stove popped softly, and outside the small, frosted window, the gray November dawn was coming up over the high country. Friends, the narrator should pause here, because what we have just watched is the still point. The center of the wheel. Everything in this story up to this moment has been moving toward that kiss, and everything after this moment will be moving away from it. The Lord in his mercy gives a man and a woman a still point sometimes. He gives them one quiet hour. He gives them coffee at a plank table and a confession told plain and a kiss that costs nothing and means everything. He gives them this so that they will have something to hold to in what comes next. Because what comes next, friends, is the storm. 2 miles down the ridge in his own smaller cabin, Thaddeus Boone was saddling his blood bay mare in the gray dawn light when a sound stopped him cold. The sound was the soft crunch of horseshoes in the snow. Not one horse. 3. Moving slowly along the lower trail, the trail that came up from Georgetown, the trail that nobody used in November because it was too steep and too exposed, and the wolves came down it in the lean times. Thaddeus stepped quietly to the door of his barn. He looked out through the crack of the hinge. 3 men on tall horses were riding slowly along the lower trail 200 yards below his cabin. They were dressed in heavy wool coats. They carried Winchester rifles and scabbards on their saddles. The lead rider was a man in a black broadcloth coat and a black bowler hat, and even at 200 yards, Thaddeus could see that he was holding a brass spyglass to his eye and studying the ridges above. Thaddeus stepped back from the door. He moved quietly the way Marcus had taught him to move when he was a boy. He went to the iron stove in the cabin, pulled the kettle off the heat so the smoke would die down and damp the firebox. He laid out his Winchester, his Colt service revolver, his hunting knife, and a leather pouch of 20 cartridges. He pulled on his bear hide coat over his wool shirt. He went to the small wooden chest at the foot of his bed and from underneath a folded quilt that had belonged to Eliza, he took out an oiled leather wallet. The wallet contained 12 folded pages of legal correspondence, 3 sworn affidavits from Pinkerton agents in Denver who had grown sick of doing Crane Ashford's wet work, a hand-drawn map of the Clear Creek burnings of 1876 with the names of the homesteaders who had died, and a sealed letter addressed to His Excellency Frederick W. Pitkin, Governor of the Territory of Colorado, Capitol Building, Denver. The narrator must tell you something now. Friends that Marcus Boone did not yet know about his own brother. Thaddeus Boone had not been idle these last 6 months. When Crane Ashford's land agent had come up to Gray's Peak in the spring, with his folded survey maps and his bag of gold double eagles offering to buy Marcus's homestead at twice its value, Marcus had said no and shut the door. Thaddeus had said nothing. But Thaddeus had ridden down to Georgetown the next week and to Denver the week after, and he had begun quietly to ask questions. He had a friend in the Territorial Land Office. He had another friend, an old Civil War comrade, who was now a senior clerk in the office of the Territorial Governor. He had spent the last 6 months while his brother trapped beaver and hunted elk and split firewood on Gray's Peak, building a slow, careful case against Nathaniel Crane Ashford and the men who did his killing. Thaddeus had not told Marcus. He had not told Marcus because Marcus, God love him, was a man who would have ridden down to Chicago in his hunting coat and tried to put a Henry rifle round through Crane Ashford's window, and he would have died in the trying. Thaddeus had been protecting his older brother the way his older brother had once protected him, quietly, without asking permission, without expecting thanks. The wallet in his hand contained enough evidence to hang Nathaniel Crane Ashford in a Denver court of law. Thaddeus tucked the wallet inside his bear hide coat against his chest, where it would stay dry. He looked out the door again. The 3 riders had moved on down the lower trail. They were heading west back toward Georgetown, where Cyrus Shaw had quartered his men in a rented warehouse 3 days ago. They had not spotted his cabin. They had not been looking for it. They had been scouting the upper ridge. They were coming for Marcus and Evelyn. Thaddeus mounted the blood bay. He rode hard up the ridge trail through the rising morning light. The mare's breath plumed white in the cold air, and her hooves threw up sprays of fresh powder, and Thaddeus rode crouched low over her neck. The Winchester laid across his thighs, and he prayed under his breath, the only prayer he knew, the one their mother had taught both her sons in the few short years she had been given with them. Lord, the Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He came up over the last rise and saw the cabin in the small clearing below, smoke rising blue and steady from the stovepipe, and he saw his brother stepping out the front door with Evelyn beside him, her braid down her back, both of them lit by the first slanting yellow rays of the morning sun. For a moment, just a moment, Thaddeus Boone stopped his horse on the rise and watched them. His brother had his arm around her shoulders. Marcus Boone, who had not touched another human being on purpose in 12 years, had his arm around the shoulders of his wife. Lord Thaddeus thought, do not let me be too late. He kicked the mare into a gallop and came down the slope in a spray of snow, and Marcus saw him coming, and his face changed, and Evelyn saw his face change and felt the world shift under her feet. Thaddeus reined up at the porch in a sliding stop. The mare was lathered. His breath came hard. Brother, he gasped. Brother! They are here. 3 scouts on the lower trail just before dawn. The man and the black bowler at the head of them. They are here. We have got perhaps 2 days, maybe 3. We need to talk. Marcus's pale blue eyes went very still. He looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked back at him. She did not cry. She did not flinch. The narrator must tell you, friends, that the young woman who had stepped down off that stagecoach 16 days ago in green silk would have crumbled at this news. But that young woman was already gone. The young woman standing on the porch of the cabin in canvas trousers, in a sheepskin vest with a single braid down her back, in a small folding knife from her brother-in-law in her pocket. That young woman simply set her shoulders and took her husband's hand and said quietly, "All right. Then we had better get inside and talk." They went in. Thaddeus dropped the iron crossbar across the door behind them. He laid his Winchester on the plank table And then with both hands, he reached inside his bear hide coat and brought out the oiled leather wallet, and he laid it down beside the rifle. Marcus stared at the wallet. What in the name of the Almighty, he said, is that? That said, Thaddeus quietly, is 6 months of riding I have not told you about. That is everything I have on Crane Ashford. Every Pinkerton affidavit I could buy or beg. The Clear Creek burnings. The forged probate codicil that gave him your wife. 2 sworn statements from clerks at the Harlow Railroad who saw him into the building the morning Edmund Harlow went off the balcony. I have a courier waiting in Georgetown who can ride for Denver tonight if I send the word. Governor Pitkin will read every page of this before sunset tomorrow. Pitkin hates Crane Ashford. He has been hunting for an excuse to move on him for 2 years. This is the excuse. The cabin was very still. Marcus looked at his younger brother for a long moment. Tad, he said quietly, you have been carrying this alone for 6 months. You would have ridden to Chicago and got yourself killed, brother. I could not let you do that. I am not as brave as you, but I am better at sitting still and writing letters. Marcus reached across the table and gripped his brother's shoulder hard. Thaddeus's eyes filled. He looked away. Evelyn stepped between them. She pulled the leather wallet to her, and she opened it, and she began in her quick, clean-educated hand to read. She read for 10 minutes without speaking. When she looked up, her cornflower eyes were burning. This will hang him, she said. Tad, this will hang him. Yes, but not before he gets here. He is already moving. He has 25 Pinkerton men in Georgetown and a Hotchkiss mountain gun in a freight car at the depot. The courier will not reach Denver in time. Even if Pitkin starts a column of territorial militia tomorrow morning, they cannot be on this mountain before the 3rd or 4th day. Crane Ashford will be at our door before then. Marcus and Thaddeus exchanged a long look. Then we hold him off, said Marcus quietly. For 3 days. We hold him off, we keep Evelyn alive, and we wait for the governor. 3 days, said Thaddeus, against 25 Pinkerton men with a mountain gun. Yes, Thaddeus laughed. It was a short, dry surprise laugh. The laugh of a man who has just been told the size of the mountain he is about to climb and has decided that he will climb it anyway. All right, brother. All right, then we had better start planning. Friends, the narrator must tell you something here. 3 people have just made a decision in a small log cabin on the side of Gray's Peak. 2 brothers and a young woman in canvas trousers and a sheepskin vest. They are about to be outnumbered 8-1. They are about to face artillery. They have 3 days. What they have that the men in Georgetown do not have is the high ground. They have 12 years of Marcus Boone's knowledge of every cornice and avalanche chute in Box Canyon on this mountain. They have Thaddeus Boone's 2 years working the Black Ridge silver mine, 3 miles to the north, a natural fortress with a single approach trail flanked by 2,000-foot drops. They have Evelyn Harlow's wallet of evidence and her father's broken pocket watch and her quick, clean, Chicago-educated mind. And they have something else. They have the fact that Cyrus Shaw, riding down off that lower trail this morning in his black bowler hat, does not yet know that the bride he has come to retrieve has stopped running. The bride, friends, has decided to fight. The cabin door was barred. The Winchester lay on the plank table. The wind was beginning to rise outside, a long, thin keen out of the high passes, the first whisper of the great storm that would come in from the northwest in 2 days' time and bury the high country in 4 feet of snow. Marcus Boone leaned over the plank table and began to draw with a piece of charcoal on a square of brown wrapping paper the map of the mountain he had memorized over 12 long winters. He marked the cabin with a small black square. He marked the Black Ridge mine with a black circle 3 miles to the north. He marked the choke point on the ridge trail where a single charge of Hercules powder could bring down 200 tons of granite into an attacking column. And in the corner of the map, very small, he marked the lower trail where Cyrus Shaw and his 3 scouts had ridden at first light this morning, and beside it he wrote a single word in his slow, careful hand. Coming. Pull your chair closer to the fire, friends. The wind is rising on Gray's Peak. The next 2 days passed in the kind of grim, focused silence that comes over men and women who know they are about to be tested. Thaddeus rode for Georgetown that same afternoon, the leather wallet wrapped twice in oilcloth and strapped flat against his ribs under the bear hide coat. He had a courier waiting in the back room of a livery stable on the west end of town, a quiet young man named Eli Matheson, who had ridden dispatch for the Union Army at Gettysburg and could put 40 miles behind him in a single winter day. By the time Thaddeus rode back up the ridge that evening, the wallet was pounding hard for Denver on the back of a fast horse, and a man Thaddeus trusted with his life was riding with it. Marcus and Evelyn spent the first day fortifying the cabin. He showed her how to shutter the windows with the heavy oak boards he had cut years ago against just such a need, and how to drop the iron crossbar across the door so that only a battering ram could break it. He laid out his arsenal on the plank table, and Evelyn looked at it without flinching. The Henry repeating rifle, a second Henry that had belonged to his father, a heavy Sharps buffalo rifle with an octagonal barrel that could put a 50 caliber round through a man at 500 yards, a pair of Colt Service revolvers, a double-barreled 12-gauge shotgun, 300 rounds of ammunition bought slow over the years, never spent, kept dry in a tin box under the bed. It was the arsenal of a man who had hoped never to use any of it. Marcus drilled her on the Henry for 2 hours that afternoon. He took her out behind the woodshed where the snow bank deadened the sound, and he set up a target made of an empty flour sack stuffed with straw and pinned to a pine stump. She fired 20 rounds. By the 10th, she was hitting the sack at 50 yards. By the 20th, she was hitting it at 75. Her shoulder was bruised purple inside her wool shirt, and she did not mention it once. "You have a steady eye," Evelyn Marcus said quietly, watching her work the lever. "Better than mine at your age." "I read a great deal," she said. "I had time. I read about the war. I read about marksmanship. I never thought I would use any of it." She lowered the rifle. She turned and looked at him in the failing light. "Marcus," she said, "if they get into the cabin, if it comes to that, I do not want to be taken alive. Do you understand me?" Marcus's pale blue eyes went very still. "It will not come to that, Evelyn. But if it does, I want your word." He looked at her for a long moment. He had seen that look in the eyes of a few men in his life, men who had been pushed past the place where anything could push them further. He had not expected to see it in the eyes of a 22-year-old heiress from Astor Street. "You have my word," he said, "but it will not come to that." She nodded once, and they went back to the cabin. That night after supper, while the wind began to rise in long, mournful notes through the eaves, Marcus showed her the Black Ridge mine on his charcoal map. The mine sat at the head of a narrow box canyon, 3 miles north of the cabin, accessible only by a single switchback trail that ran along the lip of a 2,000-foot drop. Thaddeus had worked the mine for 2 years before the silver vein played out in 1873, and he knew every drift and stope and ventilation shaft in the place. The main adit ran straight back into the granite for 400 feet before it branched. There were 2 hidden side tunnels dug as escape routes by miners who remembered the cave-ins of the Comstock. There was a small spring of fresh water at the back of the third drift. There was in a sealed wooden crate behind a rotted timber stack a forgotten cache of perhaps 20 Hercules dynamite sticks left over from the final blasting before the mine closed. 20 sticks of dynamite, a natural fortress, 2 hidden tunnels, fresh water. If they could not hold the cabin, they would fall back to the mine. They would hold the mine until Pitkin's column came up the mountain. They would hold 3 days. That was the plan. The second day, a heavy snow came down out of the northwest. 8 inches by noon, 18 inches by sundown. The cabin sat in a small cleared bowl with the timber line at its back and the long downward slope of the meadow at its front. And by twilight on the second day, the world outside the windows was a swirling white nothing. Marcus slept in 2-hour shifts that night. Thaddeus had ridden up at dusk and bedded down on the floor by the stove with his Winchester across his chest, and the 2 brothers traded the watch every 2 hours, like soldiers, one always awake at the shuttered window with a rifle on his lap, peering out through the slit at the snowbound dark. Evelyn did not sleep at all. She sat on the bare hide bed behind the canvas curtain, fully dressed the smaller, Henry across her knees, and she watched the lamp burn low on the upturned crate beside the bed. And she thought about her father. She thought about the way he had taught her to play the piano when she was 7 years old. His big, patient hands over hers on the keys, his voice soft in her ear, saying, "The music is in you, Evie. You only have to let it out." She thought about the way he had read to her from the Chicago papers every morning at breakfast when she was 12, and the way he had answered her every question, no matter how ignorant, with a slow, patient seriousness. She thought about the broken pocket watch in the little velvet bag she had hidden in the bottom of her valise, and about the marble lobby of the Harlow Railroad building, where the watch had bounced once and rolled to the foot of a brass spittoon. "Daddy," she said silently into the dark. "Daddy, I do not know if I am doing this right, but I am trying. I am trying, Daddy. Forgive me if I get it wrong." She heard the wind shift outside, a small change in the keen of it, a moment when the steady note dropped and then came back. It was the kind of small change that a city woman would never have noticed, but in 16 days of listening to the wind on Gray's Peak, Evelyn had learned to hear it. "Marcus," she said softly through the canvas curtain. "Yes, the wind has shifted. I heard it." "What does it mean?" "It means the storm is starting to break. It means by morning they will be moving." She did not answer. She lay back against the bare hide and closed her eyes, and she listened to the slow, steady breath of her husband at his post by the window, and she said one more silent prayer. "Lord, let us still be standing tomorrow night." The third day broke clear and brutally cold, 20 below at sunrise. The new snow lay in deep drifts across the meadow, glittering hard under a blue sky, and the mountain was perfectly silent, except for the small, clean sounds of branches creaking under their loads of snow. Marcus was at the window when he saw them. A column of dark figures moving slow up the meadow on snowshoes 2 miles below the cabin. He counted carefully through his brass spyglass. 24 men, a pair of pack mules pulling a heavy long object on a skid sled. The Hotchkiss gun broken down for transport, ready to be assembled. They were coming straight up the open meadow. They had not bothered to flank. They had not bothered to hide. With 24 men and a mountain gun, they did not need to. Cyrus Shaw rode at the front of the column on a tall black horse. He was the only mounted man. Marcus turned away from the window. "Tad, Evelyn, up! They are coming! We have got an hour before they reach the lower fence." Thaddeus rolled up off the floor and was on his feet in 3 seconds. Evelyn came out from behind the curtain with the Henry in her hands and her hair already braided and her sheepskin vest buttoned tight. "Are we holding here," she asked, "or running for the mine?" Marcus looked at her. Holding the cabin against 24 men with artillery was not a plan. It was a way to die. The plan had always been to slow them down at the cabin, hurt them at the choke point, and fall back to the mine where the Hotchkiss could not reach them and where they could hold a single trail with 3 rifles for 3 days. "Running for the mine," Marcus said. "But first we are going to give them something to remember. Tad, get the powder." Thaddeus nodded once and went out the back door of the cabin in his snowshoes, the canvas bag of Hercules sticks across his shoulder. The choke point was a quarter-mile down the trail from the cabin, a place where the path narrowed to 10 feet wide between a sheer granite wall on one side and a long slide down into Clear Creek on the other. Marcus had marked it on his map for a reason. A heavy charge set into the right cornice above the trail, fired at the right moment, would bring down 100 tons of snow and rock and bury the trail under 20 feet of debris. It would not kill many men, if any, but it would close the trail. It would force Cyrus Shaw to take the long way around the Upper Ridge Trail, which would cost him 4 hours and bring him through country Marcus Boone had hunted for 12 winters and knew like the lines on his own hand. 4 hours, that was what the choke point would buy them. Thaddeus had set a charge there in the dark hours before dawn. He had run the fuse back along the trail and hidden the end of it under a flat stone. All he had to do now was strike a match. While Thaddeus went down to the choke point, Marcus and Evelyn loaded the wagon. There was no time to take much. 2 heavy buffalo robes, the sealed tin of ammunition, the sharps and one Henry, a coffee pot, a frying pan, a sack of cornmeal, a slab of cured pork, a pound of dried beans, 6 tins of preserved peaches, the leather valise with the broken pocket watch and the diamond necklace, and $1,200 in gold, the rest having been hidden in the spring house under a flat stone weeks ago. Marcus's old bedroll, a small wooden box that Evelyn ran back into the cabin to get at the last moment and that Marcus did not ask about. Inside the box were 3 things: the cherry wood case with the folding knife from Thaddeus, a single dried sprig of wild yarrow she had pressed between the pages of one of Marcus's books, and the small flannel nightshirt far too large for her that smelled of cedar. She put the box under the buffalo robes. The wagon was packed in 20 minutes. Marcus harnessed Samson and Delilah, the 2 big mules, and lashed snowshoes to the wagon bed for all 3 of them. They would take the wagon as far as the granite shoulder, a mile up the trail toward the mine, where the path narrowed too tight for wheels, and then they would unhitch the mules and continue on foot. Thaddeus came running back up the trail just as Marcus was tightening the last harness buckle. His breath came short and hot. "Set," he gasped. "The fuse will run 6 minutes. I have it under the flat stone. I will fire it from the cabin window when they are halfway up." Marcus nodded. Inside, they took up positions. Evelyn at the south window with the smaller Henry. Thaddeus at the east window with his Winchester. Marcus at the loft hatch on the cabin's roof with the Sharps buffalo rifle, where he could see down the meadow for a full mile. The column came on slow, careful in 2 ranks of 12, with Cyrus Shaw and the pack mules in the center. They did not fire. They had no targets yet. They were saving the Hotchkiss for the cabin itself when they got close enough to set it up. Marcus waited. He waited until the lead rank was 400 yards out. He waited until he could see the buttons on the lead Pinkerton's overcoat. He waited until the man's face came clear in the brass scope of the Sharps, a young face no more than 30, a face that had been hired for this work and that did not know the man it was hunting. He breathed out. He squeezed the trigger. The Sharps boomed off the roof of the cabin like a cannon shot and across 400 yards of meadow. The lead Pinkerton snapped backward as if a giant invisible hand had struck him in the chest, and he went down into the snow without a sound, and he did not move again. The column stopped. There was a long single second of perfect frozen silence. Then the column boiled. Men dove flat into the snow. Men ran sideways. Cyrus Shaw shouted orders that did not reach the cabin. The pack mules with the Hotchkiss skid bolted in panic, and one of them broke a leg in a hidden rock and went down screaming, and the other tore loose and ran. Marcus reloaded the Sharps with cold, steady hands. He was already aiming for the second target. In the cabin below, Thaddeus struck a match against the iron of the stove and held it to the end of the long fuse cord that ran out under the eastern shutter across the porch and down the trail to the choke point. The fuse caught. It hissed quietly along the floor of the cabin and out under the shutter and was gone. 6 minutes, Thaddeus said quietly. The Pinkertons were moving forward again now in short rushes from cover to cover. They had no real cover in the open meadow, only the small folds of the snowdrifts, but they were trained men, and they knew how to move under fire. Marcus put down 2 more of them with the Sharps in those 6 minutes, and Thaddeus fired the Winchester twice at men who came too close to the cabin, and Evelyn fired the Henry once deliberately, and a Pinkerton who had been crawling toward the spring house on his belly stopped crawling and lay still in the snow. 3 minutes left on the fuse. Cyrus Shaw was at the choke point now. He had pushed forward to lead the assault personally. Marcus saw him through the scope just for a moment, the long black coat and the ridiculous bowler hat, and Marcus put the brass crosshairs on the man's chest and squeezed the trigger. The Sharps fired. At the last instant, Cyrus Shaw turned his head to shout an order, and the heavy .50 caliber slug that should have struck him in the heart instead tore across the front of his chest and ripped the right side of his coat open and threw him backward into the snow. He was hit. He was not killed. Marcus cursed under his breath. 2 minutes left. The Pinkertons were bunching at the choke point, now taking cover behind the rocks, returning fire toward the cabin in long, ragged volleys. Bullets spanged off the iron stovepipe on the roof. A bullet cracked through the south shutter and buried itself in the rough log wall beside Evelyn's head, and she did not flinch. She levered another round and fired again. 30 seconds. The Pinkertons were rallying. Cyrus Shaw was up on one knee in the snow, blood soaking the right side of his coat, but he was up. He was shouting orders. His men were forming up to charge the cabin. 3, 2, 1. The choke point exploded. 200 tons of granite and snow and ice came off the cliff above the trail in a single thunderous roar that rolled across the meadow and rattled the window glass in the cabin half a mile away. A great white cloud of snow boiled up from the impact 300 feet into the blue morning sky. When it began to clear a long minute later, the trail at the choke point was simply gone, buried under 20 feet of debris. 3 Pinkerton men who had been at the leading edge of the rush were buried with it, and 2 more were trapped on the wrong side, separated from their column. Cyrus Shaw was on the near side on his feet, the right shoulder of his coat black with blood, screaming orders that nobody could hear yet because the avalanche thunder was still rolling away down the canyons. "Now," said Marcus. They went. Out the back door of the cabin in their snowshoes into the cleared run he had shoveled overnight around the back of the woodshed and onto the upper trail. The wagon was already hitched. Evelyn climbed up on the seat. Thaddeus took the driver's bench. Marcus mounted the saddle horse he had tied to the back rail. They moved off through the deep snow at the steady working pace of men and mules who had only one chance and meant to take it. They did not look back. Behind them in the meadow, Cyrus Shaw was stumbling forward through the smoking debris of the choke point blood seeping through the torn right side of his coat. His bowler hat lost his cold gray eyes fixed on the small log cabin that he could see now, perfectly clearly, half a mile up the slope. "They have run," he said quietly to the Pinkerton sergeant beside him. "They have run for the mine. The brother knows the mine. It is the only place on this mountain they could hold." "Then we follow them, sir," said the sergeant. "We follow them," said Cyrus Shaw. "But we take the upper ridge. The choke point is closed. We will lose 4 hours. By dark, we will have them." Marcus had bought 4 hours. He had planned to need 3 days. He had bought 4 hours. They reached the granite shoulder, where the trail narrowed too tight for the wagon at mid-morning. They unhitched the mules, loaded the supplies onto the pack saddles, and went on by foot, leading the animals. Evelyn walked between the brothers, the Henry slung across her back, the small folding knife from Thaddeus in the pocket of her sheepskin vest. She did not talk. She put one foot in front of the other in the deep snow. By the 3rd mile, her thighs were burning and her chest ached from the thin, cold air at 11,000 feet, and she still did not talk. She just walked. They reached the Black Ridge mine at noon. The single approach trail came up the lip of the box canyon and dead-ended at the dark mouth of the main adit, a black rectangular hole cut into the granite cliff face framed by heavy oak timbers, gone gray with 30 years of weather. To the right of the entrance, a small log cabin had once housed the mine foreman. To the left, a half-collapsed ore chute slanted down into the canyon. There was nothing else. No corral, no outbuildings, just the granite and the timbers and the dark. Marcus led them inside. The first 100 feet of the adit smelled of cold, wet stone and old rust. Their feet crunched on a thin layer of gravel and broken timbers. The light from the entrance fell away behind them, and Thaddeus struck a sulfur match and lit a small kerosene lantern he had pulled from the pack saddle, and the yellow light leapt up the granite walls and showed Evelyn for the first time the place where they would either live or die. The drift went straight back 200 feet to a junction. 3 side tunnels branched off at the junction, 2 on the right, 1 on the left. The leftmost tunnel sloped slightly upward, carrying the natural ventilation from the surface. The first right tunnel ended in a rockfall after 60 feet. The second right tunnel ran another 400 feet into the mountain and ended at a small underground chamber with a year-round spring of clean, cold water seeping out of the granite wall. Thaddeus had drawn the map for Marcus over the first day, and Marcus had memorized it. Bring the mules into the junction, Marcus said. Tie them off. Evelyn, take the supplies down the right tunnel to the spring chamber. Make us a camp there. That is where you will sleep tonight. She nodded and moved off into the dark with the pack saddle in one hand and the lantern in the other. Thaddeus and Marcus went forward to the entrance. They had brought lashed to the side of the wagon and now carried in a single oilcloth bundle the 20 sticks of Hercules powder from the cache Thaddeus had remembered. They had a roll of canvas-wrapped fuse cord. They had a tin box of blasting caps. And they had a single chance to set the entrance so that when Cyrus Shaw came up the approach trail at last, he would find a closed door he could not open. They worked through the afternoon. Marcus drilled a series of careful holes into the granite above the added timbers with a star drill and a 4-pound hammer, the way the old miners had done before them. Thaddeus cut sticks of dynamite in half with his knife, fitted blasting caps, and tamped the charges into the holes with mud he had carried up in a flour sack. They ran a single long fuse from the highest charge down to a stone bench inside the adit, where Marcus would be when the time came to fire it. If Cyrus Shaw came up the trail in force, Marcus would fire the charge from inside. The whole face of the cliff would come down across the entrance, sealing them in. They would have water food for 3 days' ammunition and the back ventilation tunnel for a slow escape if it came to that. Cyrus Shaw would be on the wrong side of 50 tons of granite in the open canyon with a wounded shoulder and a broken column of men and 4 hours of daylight left. It was not a victory. It was a stalemate. But a stalemate with Pickens' column riding hard for the mountain was the same thing as a victory. They were halfway through setting the charges when Marcus heard the shouts down the trail. He pulled the brass spyglass to his eye. A quarter-mile down the approach trail, a single Pinkerton scout had come around the last bend. He saw the mine. He saw Marcus and Thaddeus at the entrance. He turned to run back and signal the column behind him. Marcus did not have time to fire the sharps. He shouldered the Henry from the pile by the entrance, thumbed back the hammer, and fired one quick standing shot at 200 yards. The scout went down. Marcus did not watch to see if he got back up. "They are here," he said to Thaddeus. "They are here early." Thaddeus looked at the half-finished charges. There were 6 holes still empty. The fuse was not yet run. How early? 20 minutes, Lord Almighty. Cyrus Shaw had not taken 4 hours. He had pushed his men through the timber on the upper ridge at a brutal forced pace, and he had cut nearly 2 hours off Marcus's estimate. The column was coming up the approach trail right now, single file Cyrus Shaw at its head, with a bandage soaked black with blood under his torn coat, and a Smith & Wesson revolver in his good hand. Marcus made the only choice that was left. "Fire what we have," he said. Thaddeus struck the match. He held it to the short fuse on the lowest charge, the one closest to the bench, the one tamped only loose. The fuse caught. They ran. They ran back into the dark of the added snowshoes left at the entrance lantern, bouncing wildly in Thaddeus's hand. Marcus caught Evelyn at the spring chamber and pulled her down behind the heavy granite ledge that ran across the back of the room. He covered her with his body. Thaddeus dropped flat behind a fallen timber. The mine shook. It shook the way a great living thing shakes when it is wounded. A long, deep, rolling boom that came down the adit like a fist of compressed air rattling the lantern, throwing dust off every ledge, popping Evelyn's ears. The mules at the junction screamed. Somewhere far above them, in the rock of the mountain, something cracked a single sharp musical note, like a giant piano string parting. Then a second boom, deeper, longer. The roof of the entrance came down. The shaking went on for perhaps 30 seconds. Then it stopped, and the dust rolled back down the adit in a slow, heavy cloud, and the only sound was the high, terrified braying of the mules and the slow drip of water from a fissure above the spring. Marcus lifted his head off Evelyn's hair. "Are you hurt?" "No, Tad." Here came Thaddeus's voice hoarse. "Here, brother. I am here." They got up. They moved forward through the dust toward the entrance. The entrance was gone. Where the dark rectangular mouth of the adit had been, There was now only a wall of broken granite blocks, some as large as a wagon, packed in tight with fractured rubble and powdered rock. A few thin shafts of daylight still came through the gaps, high up, blue and faint. The cliff face had come down across the entrance exactly as Marcus had planned, only earlier than he had planned, and only because the half-set charges had taken the cliff with them when they fired. The mine was sealed. Cyrus Shaw and what was left of his column were on the other side. So were they. Friends, the narrator must tell you something. 3 people had just sealed themselves into a granite tomb 3 miles from the nearest cabin and 4 miles from the nearest town. They had 2 days of food. They had a working spring of clean water. They had a kerosene lantern with perhaps 8 hours of fuel. They had 2 Henry rifles and a Sharps buffalo gun and 300 rounds of ammunition that they could not now use because they had nothing to shoot at. What they had that nobody had ever planned for was the silence. The cold, deep silence of a sealed mine where a man and a woman and a brother could finally sit down on the granite floor and listen to their own breathing and know that for the first time in 3 days, nothing was coming through the door. Cyrus Shaw stood on the wrong side of the rock fall and looked at it for a long time. He sent 2 men forward with picks to test the rubble. After 10 minutes, one of them came back and reported that the rock was packed too tight and the shafts of daylight were too small to admit a man. Even with a full crew of miners, in a week of work, they could not dig through. They would have to go around. Around meant climbing the cliff above the sealed entrance, a 500-foot vertical face of fractured granite in sub-zero temperatures with a wounded leader and a broken column. Around was not possible. Cyrus Shaw stood there with his bandaged shoulder bleeding slow and steady through his coat, and he understood finally that he had lost. He turned without speaking and walked back down the approach trail. 12 men followed him. 8 had been killed at the cabin or buried at the choke point. 2 were too wounded to walk and would have to be carried out on improvised litters. The Hotchkiss gun was buried under 20 feet of avalanche debris a mile back down the mountain. The pack mules were dead. The bowler hat was gone. Cyrus Shaw did not look back. He had 4 hours before nightfall. He had to be off the mountain before dark, or the cold would finish what the Boones had started. He almost made it. Eli Matheson, the courier Thaddeus had sent for Denver, had ridden the 40 miles to Georgetown in 8 hours, and from Georgetown to the territorial capital in another 18. He had handed the oilcloth-wrapped wallet directly into the hands of a senior clerk in the office of Governor Frederick W. Pitkin at 4 o'clock the previous afternoon. Pitkin had read the wallet at his desk for 2 hours, called for his territorial adjutant general at 6, and sent telegrams to the United States Marshal in Denver and the commanding officer of Fort Logan at 7. By midnight, a column of 40 mounted territorial militia under Captain James Doolittle had been riding hard out of Denver toward the Front Range. They reached the head of the Georgetown Road at 3 in the afternoon of the 3rd day. Cyrus Shaw and the remnants of his column came down the road 2 hours later, exhausted, bloody, defeated. Captain Doolittle's men were waiting for them, dismounted in a long firing line across the road, with a federal marshal and 3 deputies in the center holding warrants for Cyrus Shaw and 24 named Pinkerton agents. Cyrus Shaw saw the line and stopped. He looked at it for perhaps 10 seconds. Then he raised his good hand slowly to the level of his shoulder in the universal sign of a man who does not wish to die today. And he said quietly in his thin, reedy voice, "Gentlemen, I surrender." He was taken in chains to a holding cell in Georgetown by sundown. By midnight, he was on a wagon bound for the federal courthouse in Denver, where he would 10 weeks later be tried and convicted of attempted murder conspiracy to defraud and 3 counts of accessory to first-degree murder, and where he would, on a cold morning the following May, be hanged from a federal gallows in the courtyard of the Arapahoe County Jail. He read his Bible the night before he hanged. He did not pray. The mine. Marcus and Thaddeus and Evelyn waited inside the dark for the rest of that day. They had no way to know what was happening on the other side of the rockfall. They had only the silence. That night, they made a small fire of broken timbers in the spring chamber and ate cold bread and dried pork. The smoke went up through the natural ventilation tunnel and out a fissure on the upper face of the cliff a quarter-mile away. They could not be tracked by the smoke. They could not be heard. They were, for the first time since Cyrus Shaw had stepped down off the train in Silver Plume, perfectly safe. Evelyn fell asleep against Marcus's shoulder by the fire. Thaddeus watched them for a long time. The lantern was turned low. Marcus had his arm around her. Her face in the dim yellow light was perfectly peaceful, the face of a young woman who had run all the way across a continent and had finally, against all odds, reached the place where running was no longer required. Thaddeus thought about Eliza. He thought about her for the first time in 7 years, without the sharp, sick weight in his chest that had always come with the thought before. He thought about the way she had laughed when he had brought her up the ridge to see his finished cabin in the spring of 1870. He thought about the small wooden cradle she had been embroidering in the months before she died. He thought about the unmarked grave on the south slope behind his cabin where he had buried her and the tiny child who had not lived an hour and where he had not been able to bring himself to set a stone for 7 years. Maybe in the spring, he thought. Maybe in the spring I will set the stone. Maybe it is time. The fire burned low. The night went on. None of them knew yet that the courier had gotten through that Pitkins column was on the road, that Cyrus Shaw was already in irons in a Georgetown jail. They knew only the silence of the mountain and the slow drip of the spring and the steady breathing of 3 souls who had made it somehow to the other side of the worst day of their lives. In the morning, they set to digging. The ventilation tunnel ran up and out to a small fissure on the upper face of the cliff, a quarter-mile of slow hands and knees crawling through cold, close stone. By mid-afternoon, Thaddeus had widened the fissure enough for a small person to climb through. Evelyn went first with a rope around her waist, and she came out into the cold blue afternoon onto a high snow shelf that overlooked the canyon, and the first thing she saw was the long blue line of the Front Range rolling away to the east. And the second thing she saw was a column of 40 mounted militiamen winding up the lower trail toward the canyon mouth, with a federal marshal at their head and a small fluttering flag of the United States above them. She sat down on the snow shelf and cried. Not the silent, careful tears she had cried in Crane Ashford's parlor. Not the bitter, humiliated tears she had cried over the burned coffee. The other kind. The tears that come at the end of a thing when a body has held itself together for a long time and is finally allowed to fall apart in the warm light of safety. Marcus came out of the fissure behind her. He sat down beside her in the snow, and he put his arm around her, and he did not say anything for a long while. "It is over," he said finally. "It is over," she said. Thaddeus came out behind them, blinking in the sunlight, and he saw the column of militia in the distance, and his shoulders, which had carried 6 months of secret riding and 3 days of armed siege, slowly settled. Lord, Thaddeus said quietly, "Thank you." The narrator must tell you, friends, that this is the moment. This is the moment in a story like this when the watcher gets to take a long, slow breath and let it out. The villain has been beaten. The brave have been spared. The Lord in his mercy has let 3 good people walk out into the blue afternoon air and live. But the story is not yet finished. A story like this is not finished until the villain has answered for what he has done. A story like this is not finished until the bride has stood in a courtroom and named her father's killer. A story like this is not finished until the time has come to plant the next thing in the ground. That is the work of the next chapter. 850 miles to the east, in the offices of the Crane Ashford Railroad and Holding Company, on the top floor of a stone building overlooking the Chicago River, Nathaniel Crane Ashford was reading a telegram. The telegram had come up that morning from a Pinkerton lieutenant who had been left as a reserve in Georgetown. It said in plain, unembellished language that Cyrus Shaw had been captured by United States Marshals on the afternoon of the 29th of November, that 12 Pinkerton agents had been killed or wounded in an attack on a homestead on Gray's Peak, that the Hotchkiss gun was lost, and that the bride and the man, Boone and his brother, had survived and were at the moment of writing in protective custody under the personal authority of Governor Frederick W. Pitkin of the Territory of Colorado. Crane Ashford read the telegram twice. He set it down on his desk. He reached for the crystal decanter of Tennessee bourbon on the corner of the desk, and he poured a small measure into a tumbler with a steady hand, and he drank it, and he set the tumbler down. A federal marshal walked into his office at 3 minutes after 4 o'clock that afternoon carrying a warrant signed by a federal judge in Denver. Crane Ashford was charged with the murder of Edmund Harlow on the morning of July 17, 1878. He was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud in the matter of the forged probate codicil. He was charged with the murder of Hannah Coltrane on the night of November 12th. He was charged with conspiracy to commit kidnapping. He was charged with the attempted murder of Marcus Boone of Gray's Peak. The trial took 6 weeks. Evelyn Harlow Boone testified for 2 of those weeks. She wore black. She wore her grandmother's diamond necklace at her throat. She held the broken pocket watch in her small white hand for the entire time she was on the stand, and she described in a steady, educated voice every word her father had ever spoken to her about Nathaniel Crane Ashford. Every dinner table remark Crane Ashford had made to her in the 6 weeks of her captivity, every page of every document in the leather wallet that Thaddeus Boone had compiled over 6 months of secret writing. Crane Ashford's lawyers tried on the 3rd day to suggest that the broken watch was a fabrication. Evelyn produced from her reticule a sworn affidavit from a watchmaker in St. Louis who had identified the inscription inside the case as Edmund Harlow's, and who had on examination identified the strike pattern on the crystal as the imprint of a man's signet ring. The signet ring on the 3rd finger of Nathaniel Crane Ashford's left hand, the same signet ring he was wearing in court on that very afternoon. The courtroom was silent for a long minute after she said it. Crane Ashford was convicted on the 18th of January, 1879. The combined Harlow and Crane Ashford lines were not formed. The Crane Ashford holdings were broken up under federal antitrust order, and a quarter of them were sold at public auction. Nathaniel Crane Ashford lost 3/4 of his fortune in the receivership. The remainder he spent on appeals. The appeals failed. He spent the last 11 years of his life in a single room in a boarding house on Clark Street, 3 blocks from the offices that had once been his. He lived alone. He wrote letters to former associates that were not answered. He drank too much. His second wife, a young woman of 22, whom he had married in a great hurry 6 weeks after Evelyn's escape, left him within 6 months and took her settlement with her. When he died in March of 1890 of a stroke in his rented room, he was found by his landlady 3 days later. There were no flowers at his funeral. There were no mourners. The notice in the Chicago Tribune ran 2 lines, and the second line was a misprint of his name. Friends, the narrator must tell you something here, because this is the part of the story that matters. The Lord does not always punish a wicked man with a bullet or a hangman's noose. Sometimes the Lord punishes a wicked man by giving him exactly what he asked for. Crane Ashford had wanted all his life to be the largest man in the room. He had wanted to be feared and admired and untouched. The Lord let him become exactly that. And when the Lord took it away, he took it away slowly over 11 years in a single rented room with no one to grieve and no one to remember. That is karma, friends. That is the slow, patient justice of the high country. The trial ended on a Friday. Marcus and Evelyn took a westbound train out of Denver on the following Tuesday. Thaddeus had ridden home a week before, having given his testimony on the 7th day of the trial and been excused. By the time the wagon brought Marcus and Evelyn up the long switchbacks to Silver Plume, on a bright cold afternoon in early February, the cabin on Gray's Peak was waiting for them, and there was a small, fresh stone on the south slope behind Thaddeus's cabin, and the stone read in plain, careful letters cut by Thaddeus's own hand, Eliza Margaret Boone, beloved wife, mother, taken 1871, gone home. He had set the stone the morning he came back. It had been time. Spring came late that year. Marcus and Evelyn were married properly and legally in the front parlor of the Silver Plume Methodist Church on a Sunday morning in early May, with the Reverend Obadiah Whitaker officiating and Thaddeus standing as best man, and the entire town of Silver Plume crowded into the small wooden pews. Josiah Miller stood up before the ceremony, and read aloud the affidavit they had signed in his office on the 14th of November, and then Evelyn signed the proper marriage register in her own true name, Evelyn Harlow Boone. Abel Fairweather brought a wedding cake from his store at his own expense and made a short, surprisingly graceful apology in front of the congregation for his words on that November afternoon. And Evelyn shook his hand and accepted the apology with such quiet good grace that the matter was never spoken of again. The Reverend Whitaker pronounced them husband and wife. Marcus kissed her on the porch of the church in the bright May sunlight with a small wind blowing down off the high country and the smell of new pine and meltwater rising out of the meadow. And the people of Silver Plume threw rice and watched them, and Thaddeus stood off to one side with his hat in his hand and his eyes wet, in his old amber whiskey eyes looking at his older brother in a way Marcus had not been looked at in 25 years. Their first son was born in the cabin on Gray's Peak on a snowy night in February of 1880. They named him Edmund Harlow Boone after Evelyn's father, and Thaddeus delivered him with his own hands when the midwife from Silver Plume could not get up the trail in time, and Marcus stood by the bed holding Evelyn's hand and praying without words while the snow came down outside and the cabin walls held back the long cold of the high country one more time. Their daughter, Margaret Eliza Boone, was born 2 years later on a bright morning in February of 1882, and Thaddeus wept openly when he saw her in his sister-in-law's arms, and he asked in a voice none of them had ever heard him use if he might be allowed to be her godfather. They told him yes. He carried the small girl down the slope to the south burying ground 3 weeks later and stood over the stone of his first wife and his first child with his small goddaughter cradled in the crook of his arm, and he spoke a long, quiet prayer that nobody heard but himself and the small mountain and the Lord who watches over both. A second son was born in May of 1884 named Thaddeus Jr. at his uncle's protest, and the matter was settled by Evelyn over Thaddeus's protest with the calm finality that had become her signature. And so the boy was Tad Jr. from the day of his christening forward. The Boone Ranch grew. Marcus, with a portion of the recovered Harlow inheritance that Evelyn had insisted be put back into the land, expanded the homestead in the summer of 1880. He built a larger main house with a wide front porch and 4 bedrooms upstairs. He built a proper barn big enough for 10 head of cattle and a milking parlor. He built a small stone schoolhouse on the meadow below the cabin, and Evelyn taught reading and ciphering there to the children of the homesteaders for 3 afternoons a week, free of charge for the rest of her life. Thaddeus moved up to the main house in the fall of 1880. He told his brother that the small cabin 2 miles down the ridge was no longer the right place for him. He left it standing. He visited it sometimes. He set fresh flowers by the stone on the south slope every spring and every fall. The territorial governor, Frederick W. Pitkin, declared a private commendation for Thaddeus Boone of Gray's Peak in the spring of 1879 and sent him a letter on official territorial paper that praised his discreet service to the cause of justice. Thaddeus read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and put it away in a drawer. He did not show it to Marcus. He did not show it to anyone. 20 years later, when his nephew Edmund found the letter while clearing out his uncle's effects after Thaddeus's death from a quiet pneumonia in the winter of 1899, the letter was still folded the way Thaddeus had folded it, and the creases were soft from 20 years of being touched. A great many years passed. The narrator must tell you, friends, that the Boone family lived long and lived well. Marcus Boone walked with a small limp for the rest of his life, a souvenir of a fall he had taken on the rock slide in the descent from the Black Ridge mine on the day after the siege ended. But the limp did not stop him. He trapped beaver until he was 60. He hunted elk until he was 65. He died in his bed in the main house on Gray's Peak in the autumn of 1910, with his wife beside him and his 3 grown children gathered around the bed and the smell of new bread coming up from the kitchen below. He was 70 years old. His last words were a quiet question to Evelyn. "Are the children inside?" he asked. "They are inside," she said. "They are all inside." "All right, then," he said. "All right." Evelyn Harlow Boone outlived him by 12 years. She ran the schoolhouse until she was 60. She read every newspaper in the territory until her eyes failed. She wrote in her last decade a small private memoir of the events of the winter of 1878, which she sealed in a wooden box and gave to her oldest grandson, with instructions that it not be opened until 50 years after her death. The grandson kept his promise. The memoir was opened in 1972. It is the source of much of what you have heard tonight. The cabin on Gray's Peak still stands. It is owned now by a great-granddaughter of Marcus and Evelyn, who lives in Denver and visits in the summers. The Black Ridge Mine is sealed forever, the entrance buried under 50 tons of granite that nobody has tried to clear in 147 years. The choke point on the lower trail is still closed. The pines have grown up over the rubble and the trail is gone, and only the old-timers in Silver Plume remember why a perfectly good wagon road suddenly stops at a rock slide that nobody ever explains. If you go up to Gray's Peak in October when the aspens are turning gold and the first snow has dusted the high country and the air is so clear it tastes like glass, you can sometimes find, if you know where to look, a small stone on the south slope of a ridge 2 miles from the main cabin. The stone is gray and weathered. It has been there a long time. The letters on it are still readable. Eliza Margaret Boone, beloved wife mother, taken 1871, gone home. And next to it, set there sometime in the spring of 1910, a second stone of matching gray granite, smaller, set deliberately just a little to the side, the way a younger brother might once have stood beside an older one on a porch. Thaddeus Boone, 1843 to 1899. He kept faith with his brother. That is the end of the story, friends. I hope you have enjoyed it. I told it the way my grandfather told it to me, sitting on his porch up in the wet mountains of southern Colorado, wrapped in an old wool blanket while the coyotes called from the foothills. Some stories you forget. Others stay with you. This one stayed with me for 60 years, and now I have given it to you. Pull your chair a little closer to the fire one last time. The stone the men of Chicago threw away in the autumn of 1878 turned out to be the diamond she had always been. The mountain man who had been ready to die alone in a fever turned out to have 12 good years of marriage and 3 good children and a long, quiet old age waiting for him. The brother who had been carrying his evidence walled in secret for 6 months turned out to have, when the time came, the courage of a Roman soldier and the patience of a Methodist saint. And the wicked man in the Lakeshore Drive estate, who had thought that money and a forged codicil could buy him whatever he wanted in this world, turned out to be wrong about that. In the end, in the slow, patient way the Lord uses to be right about everything. The fire is burning low. The long, cold winters always end, friends. Spring always comes. The stone the builders rejected always turns out in the end to be the cornerstone. That is the lesson of Gray's Peak. That is the story of Marcus and Evelyn Boone. Until we meet again at the next campfire, keep your fires burning bright and your powder dry and your hearts open to the frightened creature who comes to your door in the storm. This has been your narrator, Marcus, from Frontier Rescue Stories. Go in peace, friend.